Preface. Of all the subjects in the religious history of the ancient world, not one, surely, has given rise to a more extensive literature than that of the mysteries, both Greek and Oriental. It is above all the latter which have attracted the attention of scholars as phenomena particularly representative of the spiritual climate in the Mediterranean area at the end of the pre-Christian and the beginning of the Christian era. They were, after all, cosmopolitical in character, and they displayed a capacity of spreading and taking root in a variety of places. Unlike most of the Greek mysteries, such as those of Eleusis, Andania, Thebes, and Samothrace, which were limited to certain sanctuaries, in fact, the Oriental mysteries were not bound to a single cultic center. Ever since Ch. Lobek's Aglaophamus, a monumental collection of sources on the Greek mystery cults, research on the subject has flourished. Towards the end of the last century and the first decades of the present century, as we know, investigation found a particularly favorable terrain in the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule, whose comparative method and interest in the various religious traditions of the Near East appeared to provide the ideal context for an analysis of such problems. Yet we need hardly recall that, however much the mysteries have been examined in themselves, the study of these phenomena, even in the broader framework of the religious history of the period, has been mainly related to the research on the origins and the nature of Christianity. We see this both when the question was confronted directly and explicitly, with the object of situating the Christian episode in its historical setting, and when it was used rather as the background for an analysis of the mystery cults undertaken all too frequently with an implicit comparison with the themes and doctrinal contents of Christianity in mind. This is no place to trace the history of a type of research which still gives rise to the most varied investigations and discussions. All we need note is the priority assumed by the question of the mysteries. It ended up by being affected to a greater or lesser extent by the different positions on the one hand of those who stressed the massive contribution of pagan language and concepts to the formation of Christianity, and on the other of those who denied such influences and preferred to emphasize the characteristics peculiar to the new religious message and its direct connection with the Judaic traditions. Indeed, this debate led all too often to a simplification of the complex and multiple phenomena gathered in the category of the mysteries, while at the same time precedence was given, within these mysteries, to those aspects or elements which would appear to lend themselves better, by analogy or by contrast, to a comparison with Christianity, especially in its Pauline formulation. This is how the celebrated definition of mystery religions was reached, suggested by Ritzenstein and accepted more or less explicitly by numerous scholars. It seemed to confer on those cults of an esoteric and initiatory character, to which it was applied an organic and autonomous religious physiognomy, hardly corresponding to the historical reality of the phenomena in question. Now, not only does each of these phenomena fit into a flexible religious context of a polytheistic type, but they usually represent a specific aspect of the cult attributed to a particular deity in that same context. Thus, for example, the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece are a completely individual and historically identifiable form of the cult of Demeter, while the mysteries of Dionysus only constitute a single aspect of the varied and multiform phenomenon of the Dionysiac religion, whose origins, procedure, and historical development still have to be studied. As for the mysteries of Isis, they are one of the components, and probably a late one, formed under Greek influence, of the vast panorama of Egyptian religion and of the cult of Isis itself, with a complex history stretching back over the centuries. We have a similar situation in the case of the mysteries of the cult of the Great Mother Cybele, of Anatolian origin but naturalized in Greece at least as early as the 6th century BC, and officially introduced into Rome in the 3rd century BC. In all the cases mentioned, the initiatory esoteric rites which constitute the mysteries of the deities only represent one aspect of the various forms of the cult attributed to them in their areas of origin and in the centers of dissemination of that cult in the Hellenistic and Roman oikumene. The situation of Roman Mithraism is quite unique from this point of view. Although it has a certain relationship of continuity with the ancient Iranian cult of Mithras, it constitutes an organic and autonomous religious context which had so entirely assumed a mystery shape that, of all the cults with an initiatory esoteric structure in antiquity, this alone deserves to be defined as a mystery religion. The tendency to regard the mystery cults as religious forms substantially akin to one another despite the variety of the deities and the ethnic traditions from which each one originated, was due to a series of elements believed to be common to them all, and to constitute their specificity from a religious historical point of view. Even if it is a slight oversimplification, we can say that in all the attempts to classify the mysteries, scholars have concentrated essentially on the type of the deity who is the object of the cult, the specific ritual procedure of the cult, and the apparent purposes of its celebration. To have identified and circumscribed these three aspects of the phenomena in question was no doubt a laudable result of research into the peculiar nature of the mysteries. All too frequently, however, owing to the German school of religious history and those scholars who, to a varied degree, accepted its conclusions on this particular subject. The definition of these aspects suffered from the theoretical premises of the school itself and from the attitude described above. In other words, the necessity of the comparative method in examining religious facts in order to detect kindred, or even common, aspects and elements was stressed. Research into the mysteries was put in relation to Christianity, and was thus largely dominated by the objective of situating the phenomena comparatively. Since the peculiarity of the Christian message seemed to reside in its being a message of salvation based on the person of Christ, a figure both human and divine who was subject to an earthly vicissitude with death and resurrection, and at the same time connected with a sacramental practice which fulfilled that salvific promise, establishing a direct relationship between the worshipper and Christ, scholars sought in the contemporary pagan sphere for religious phenomena which might present some affinity to these elements peculiar to Christianity. This, as we know, often took place in the perspective of the Erklärung, where it was readily admitted that an analogy between the facts being compared automatically amounted to an explanation in the sense of a genetic derivation of one fact from another which was believed to be, or actually was, prior to it. The mystery cults, then, were examined from this specific angle, which seemed the one most likely to offer solutions to the problem posed. The object was to discover whether these cults, which appeared so successful in late Hellenism, and round which the most vital forces of the pagan resistance in the last years of the empire assembled, contained soteriological elements centered on the divinity whose destiny, celebrated in a liturgical and sacramental context, was believed to have an effect on the destiny of man. As we know, the answer to these questions was affirmative. Once Fraser's formula of the dying and rising God had come into its own as a definition of the nature of the mystery gods, the notion of the soteriological efficacy of the god's vicissitude on the initiate who was ritually assimilated in the destiny of the deity through a mystic experience of death and rebirth was fully accepted. The soteriology of the mysteries was thus regarded as clearly, if not exclusively, orientated towards eschatology. The participant in one of the many esoteric initiatory cults of the ancient world appeared as a man preoccupied with his own existence after death, determined to guarantee for himself a life of bliss in the hereafter, but already capable of anticipating this happy destiny in the ritual experience, through a process of mystically obtained inner regeneration, which made of him a new man with an intimate spiritual relationship with his God. Criticisms of the definition of the mystery gods as dying and rising gods were advanced from various sides, and present-day religious historical research has, in the words of Brelich, virtually dismantled this assumed type of divinity. This does not mean, however, that we should go to the opposite extreme and deny a certain typological affinity between the divinities at the center of the ancient mystery cults. Indeed, like the protagonists of the mythical ritual complexes usually defined as fertility cults, the gods of the mysteries are subject to vicissitudes which include crisis, disappearance, sometimes even death, but also a positive outcome. In some cases, this outcome entails a typical alternating rhythm of presence and absence, asserted in the myth and celebrated in the cult, as in the case of the Eleusinian Chore Persephone, of Adonis, and of certain Dionysiac cults whose ritual structure and mythical background cannot, unfortunately, be reconstructed with any certainty. Suffice it to think of the ritual of the Delphic Thyades and the contemporary one of the Hosioi, of the cult of Lerna, and other all too little known ritual complexes. Sometimes the outcome of the divine vicissitude includes the acquisition of a new status beyond death, or of a survival in death, as in the case of Attis, who does not die completely, and whose presence is celebrated ritually with annual ceremonies. A particular position is occupied in this perspective by the invincible Mithras of Roman Mithraism. Although he experiences neither defeat nor death, he would seem to be subject to a vicissitude, demanding exhausting efforts and the most strenuous undertakings and risks when it comes to accomplishing those maxima divum mentioned in the inscriptions of Santa Prisca, and which seem to consist essentially in that enterprise of cosmic significance, the tauroctony. A further element which the deities in question have in common is their connection, variously defined, with the sphere of nature. A certain parallelism develops between their own vicissitude and the seasonal cycle, agrarian rhythms, or anyhow chthonic fertility, and the realm of animal and human fertility. We are thus probably entitled to refer to a category, varied and flexible, but sufficiently homogeneous from a typological point of view, which covers the theme of the vicissitude that distinguishes the personality and the destiny of the mystic god from the type of the Olympic god within a polytheistic structure. The latter, of course, is characterized by stability, and despite the multiple adventures of an anthropomorphic nature of which he is the protagonist, he is extraneous to a direct contact with the sphere of suffering and death. Suffice it to recall the Homeric definition of the gods as blessed immortals. The present-day religious historical research has rejected the classificatory scheme of the dying and rising god, which has turned out to be inadequate for the definition of the varied and multiple historical reality of the facts examined. Scholars persist, however, in attempting to detect a specific typology, suitable for including the various deities of the mystery contexts, without repressing the characteristics peculiar to each one. They are still concerned with the problem of the possible soteriological content of the cult pertaining to those deities considered essentially as saviors. The problem is complicated by the preliminary difficulty of defining the very notion of salvation, both in a general sense, universally valid from a religious historical point of view, and in specific relation to the paganism of late antiquity, in which we can situate the mystery cults themselves. Now we can probably only talk of salvation in relation to what we want to be saved from. The concept in question thus assumes a significance in the broader framework of the particular world picture which every religious context expresses insofar as it is a specific component of a definite cultural tradition. Emphasis has been rightly laid on the risk implicit in giving too broad a meaning to the notion of salvation, understood as a guarantee of human existence provided by the superhuman beings to whom the cult is directed. In this sense, all religions and nearly all superhuman entities, with the exception of those who are the object of an apotropaic cult, or who are considered evil, and whose intervention in human life is feared and shunned, could be regarded as saviors, if, that is, a religious relationship has been established in order to obtain the benevolence of these superhuman beings and the benefits which they can bestow. The notion of salvation was then restricted, being confined to those religious contexts in which it appeared as the liberation from reality and from the normal conditions of existence regarded as the result of a decline, an accident, or original sin. In his contribution to the volume offered to E.O. James on the subject of the Savior God, Abrelick accepts this meaning of the religious historical concept of salvation and stresses the basic incompatibility between this concept and all religious structures of a polytheistic type which assume the total acceptance of present reality, with its divine balances and its natural rhythms insofar as it is the result of a cosmogonic activity intended to establish order after overcoming initial chaos. Insofar as they are agents of cosmogonic enterprises or guarantors of the present functioning of the cosmos over whose departments they usually preside, the gods of polytheism would thus be intrinsically incompatible with the type of the Savior God. The former are in fact almost absorbed by cosmic reality and are the custodians of the rhythms of existence from which man in a soteriological context wishes to escape. When confronted by the problem of the mystery gods, typically polytheistic, and yet so frequently referred to as saviors, however, Abrelick admits that the dying god could assume a soteriological significance in the Hellenistic Roman period, when ancient polytheism was disintegrating. He goes on to quote the famous mystery formula told by Firmicus Maternus concerning the saved god, and the K Tov WV Arurpia, in store for the initiates as the attestation of this soteriological significance, and as a possible allusion to the idea of the resurrection of a deity whose identity remains uncertain. The central problem of the mysteries thus remains. Religious historical research has to establish beyond hypotheses and possibilities if, and exactly how, the divine protagonists of the initiatory esoteric cults of the various polytheistic contexts of the Mediterranean area have actually adopted that soteriological significance. This question is further complicated by the basic problem underlying the definition of the concept of salvation, a problem which does not appear to have been solved in the alternative between a broad, almost generic meaning which would include every possible religious expression in which the superhuman beings are regarded as beneficial to man, and the specific sense of liberation from reality and from the conditions of present existence which really implies a refusal of these conditions. In fact, even if such an attitude can be said to characterize certain religious contexts whose soteriology rests on dualistic bases of an anti-cosmic type, it still cannot be applied to the notion of salvation in other religious traditions, which are also typically orientated in a soteriological direction. The Iranian Zoroastrian tradition, for example, with its basic dualistic inspiration, elaborates a soteriology entailing a total commitment of man to his present existence in the world, in order to achieve a definitive liberation from the contamination of demoniac forces which are lethal, or in any case damaging, to the supreme value, life on all its levels. We can turn next to the great religions of history such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, where salvation appears as an individual and collective adhesion to the only creating God, architect of the whole of reality, after all obstacles have been overcome. These obstacles do not consist in reality itself or in the typically human conditions of existence, but in a complex of negative ethical conditions and forms of behavior which remove man from God. In Christianity, in particular, salvation thus becomes salvation from sin, and certainly not from reality in the world. Salvation is an ever more intimate and profound communion with divine life, mediated by Christ who, after a first sinful deed at the beginning of human history and a long series of individual and collective sins, has, in his double nature of God and man, restored the harmonic relationship of the creature with his Creator. Therefore, we should delve still further into the problem in order to reach a definition of the concept of salvation. Without lapsing into a generalization useless to historical analysis, this concept should be sufficiently flexible to cover a whole range of religious phenomena, vast and varied, but also essentially homogeneous. This is certainly not the place to attempt such a complex undertaking. Suffice it to have indicated the general terms of the problem in which the more limited and specific question of the soteriology of the mystery cults can be set. This question, moreover, provides a useful starting point for the confrontation of the broader topic, once the insufficiency of the alternative between the two meanings of the concept of salvation outlined above has been made quite clear. On the one hand, it is in connection with the mystery gods, in their own typological specificity, to dramatic adventures, and themselves in need of salvation, that there emerges still more clearly the vagueness of too vast and ill-defined a use of the concept in question, and its uselessness for distinguishing the mythical ritual complex gravitating around these deities from that pertaining to other deities. On the other hand, the meaning of salvation in the sense of liberation from the present conditions of human existence and ultimately from worldly reality, which leads us to deny any soteriological element to polytheistic systems, is somewhat limited if referred to the characters of the mystery cults. For these are typically polytheistic deities. They are marked, however, by a particular destiny, and they are the object of a cult which confers on the worshipper a specific religious connotation whose precise nature, qualities and effect on the conditions of present and future existence have yet to be analyzed. Nor can we overcome this antinomy by resorting to the idea of a transformation undergone by these deities and their respective cults in the late Hellenistic period entailing a soteriological significance which was formerly lacking. If by transformation we mean the passage of some of these figures from mystic to mystery deities, in other words to deities of an initiatory esoteric cult which celebrates their vicissitude and establishes a special relationship between the devotee and the god himself, then the basic terms of the problem remain unchanged. On the one hand, however, they move in time, and on the other, they raise the historical and phenomenological question of the mysteries. We must ask ourselves what religious motivations attended such a transformation, if it is an internal process of development or an influence exerted by other cults, themselves already constructed according to the mystery pattern, or an adaptation to such a pattern considered more suitable for the expression of certain religious values. These religious values include that very same soteriological significance which the figures in the cults in question would have adopted. So further questions arise: was this soteriology inherent in the type of the mystery god as such? Do the deities of non-mystery origin adopt it when they adopt that particular mystery dimension, or is it a process of transformation which affects all the cults with an initiatory esoteric structure from the earliest, like those of Eleusis and Samothrace, to those of a more recent date, like the mysteries of Isis and Osiris, of Cybele and Attis, or of Mithras? Only in this second case could we appeal to that disintegration of polytheism which took place in late antiquity, and which might account for a radical change of perspective owing to which polytheistic deities conceived as the custodians of order and cosmic functioning, and thus non-saviors by definition, became savior gods, that is, the agents of man's escape from that order, and those cosmic rhythms of which they were the privileged divine expression. But does this type of solution do justice to the historical reality? Suffice it to consider the case of Eleusis. Can we deny a soteriological character to the Eleusinian mysteries, which already appear in the 7th to 6th century BC in the hymn to Demeter, when they proclaim as the man who has seen the sacred rites and who will consequently enjoy a special destiny in this life and the next? And yet the rites of Eleusis do not imply an escape from the normal conditions of existence. At least in the classical period, moreover, these rites were an official cult of the Athenian state, which expected well-being and prosperity from their celebration. The Homeric hymn, furthermore, attributes to Demeter the foundation of the mysteries. It sees it as an act that sanctions once and for all her activity as a goddess, guaranteeing the order of agricultural rhythms after the dramatic crisis entailed by the wedding of her daughter, which induced her to retire from the very office due to her in a polytheistic system regulated by the law of the specific divine responsibilities for the various cosmic departments. Nor are there any grounds for claiming that the Eleusinian ideology underwent substantial transformations in a late period. Even Cicero still indicates the double benefit of the mysteries in bestowing the fundamental principles which adorn human life, both in the Laetitia Vivendi and in the Spes Melior Moriendi. A positive prospect in the hereafter, raising the question of soteriology, does not therefore imply a depreciation or a rejection of the conditions of present existence. Indeed, the mystery cult, in conformity with the polytheistic structure on which it is based, actually guarantees these conditions. Where each of the mystery cults, whether Greek or Oriental, is concerned, we should therefore avoid all preconceived ideas and uncalled for generalizations and try to identify its peculiarity. At the same time, we should bring to light any analogy or element it might have in common with the others. By thus it will be possible to solve the problem of the soteriological character of the ancient mysteries and their divine protagonists, and to define the specific significance of the soteriology pertaining to such cults. By clarifying one of its fundamental aspects, we will be in a better position to formulate the historical and phenomenological question of the mysteries, and to tackle it without the intrusion of facile comparisons or extraneous problems. The present research on the cult of Cybele is intended as an approach to this vast topic through the study of a particular environment. It is in relation to this environment, moreover, that we shall encounter, in all their urgency and complexity, the many problems briefly outlined here. This study arose from a specific interest in the dissemination of the Oriental cult in the West during the Hellenistic Roman period. It matured at time of the research project on the mystic and soteriological aspects of such cults directed by Prof. Dr. U. Bianchi, professor of the history of religions at the University of Rome, a project which has borne fruit in 2 international colloquia on the religio-historical character of Roman Mithraism with particular reference to the documentary sources of Rome and Ostia and on the soteriology of the Oriental cults in the Roman Empire. These colloquia, and the exchange of experiences and comparison of methodologies which ensued, have contributed greatly to the enrichment of the specific field of my research. I am therefore grateful to all my colleagues who took part in these meetings, displaying their own learning and personal commitment to the discussion and study of the subject in question. In the first place, my thanks are due to Prof. U. Bianchi, the former mystagogue of my initiation into religious historical studies, a knowledgeable and perceptive master who has continued to offer me fresh stimulation. The results of these 2 colloquia were published in the ePro series of Prof. Dr. M. J. Vermaseren, under whose patronage the second colloquium was held. Every scholar is indebted to his learning and to his fundamental contributions to our acquaintance with Oriental cults in general, and with the cult of Cybele in particular. He is, of course, erecting a perennial monument to the latter with the invaluable CCA, supplemented by his Cybele and Attis, the myth and the cult, in which he records the results of more than 50 years of research on the subject since the classic work by H. Grayo, and which is now an indispensable book of reference. I have been privileged to enjoy his friendship ever since the far-off years when I wrote I Culti Orientali in Sicilia for that same series, and I owe to his generosity numerous subsidiary bibliographical references necessary for the completion of this study. Thanks to him, the present work, first published in a series of the Istituto di Studi Storico-Religiosi of the University of Messina, now appears with numerous additions and revisions, in an English translation in the series of ePro, the best possible place for a new edition. I therefore take pleasure in expressing my deep gratitude to a friend and master, and I would also like to thank Mrs. M.E.C. Vermaseren van Haren, Dr. M.B. de Boer, and Dr. J.J.V.M. Dirksen, who have been so kind and prompt in satisfying my requests for bibliographical material. Introduction. The deity referred to in Greek sources of the 5th century BC, under the title of or appears in actual fact to have been the Phrygian goddess Cybele, who received numerous toponymical nicknames in her Anatolian homeland, frequently derived from those mountains over which she rules in a particularly privileged manner. The close connection between the goddess and the mountains emerges, moreover, from the attribute of which characterizes her. Often identified with Rhea, the mother of the Olympic gods according to Hesiod's Theogony, and sometimes associated with Demeter, for the Phrygian goddess seems, in these sources, to have already been partially Hellenized by way of a process undoubtedly inaugurated by those Greeks from Asia who were the first to come into contact with the divinity. According to Will 5, it was precisely in the Greek colonies of Asia Minor that there developed the iconographical type of the goddess veiled and seated, with a small lion on her knees, sometimes inside a naskos which, at any rate from the 6th century BC onwards, represented Cybele. It was probably on the basis of this ancient model that Agoracritus of Paros elaborated, for the Athenian Metroon, the cult image of the goddess with tympanum and patera, seated on a throne among lions, which was to become the canonical representation of the mother of the gods for the rest of her history. Aside from the iconographical evidence, we are still left with the difficulty of appreciating fully the effects of that process of Hellenization on the nature of the Phrygian goddess and the procedure of her cult. For it is impossible to resort to a direct comparison with contemporary documents concerning the Phrygian, or, in a broader sense, the Anatolian, world in order to establish the quality and degree of the possible transformations undergone by the character of the Divine Mother and her mythical ritual complex as a result of her encounter with the Greek religious sphere. Admittedly, it now seems possible to reconstruct a sort of Anatolian prehistory of the goddess thanks to the highly advanced study of Assyrian, Mitannish, Kurish and Hittite documents which have yielded the name of a goddess, Kubaba, who can almost certainly be fitted into a line of development leading to the Phrygian Cybele. Nevertheless, little to nothing is known about the nature and attributes of this goddess and the character of her cult. What still remains valid at all events are the conclusions of Laroche who, after an attentive scrutiny of all aspects of the problem, acknowledged that the elements peculiar to the Phrygian Cybele as she appears in Western sources, in other words the orgiastic character of the cult and the association with Attis, can in no way be applied to the Anatolian Kubaba. Both these elements would seem to be the result of an encounter between the ancient local tradition concerning Kubaba and a foreign religion with orgiastic and ecstatic tendencies completely alien to the Hittite religious world. The chronological period in which this syncretism would appear to have taken place can be situated between the 12th and the 6th centuries BC. The Balkan area can be regarded as the probable homeland of that type of religion since it was around 1000 BC, that, to our knowledge, the Thracian Phrygian tribes migrated to the Anatolian peninsula. The circumstances and the details of such an encounter defy historical investigation. The Phrygian rock monuments are of no use to us, especially since we should accept the attribution to the 7th to 6th century BC, recently made by R.D. Barnett 10 rather than the very early dating suggested by W. Ramsey. In some of them we get the figure of the great goddess occasionally accompanied by the lion and her name in the form. Even if we share Barnett's conclusions as to the cultic, rather than the funerary, character of such monuments and their probable relationship with streams of water, we cannot infer anything precise about the details of the cult practiced and the specific attributes of the deity. All we can say for sure is that, as in the Western documents, it is her maternal quality which is emphasized. Neumann has identified as Cybele the goddess with a tall polos and naked bust, accompanied by 2 small male figures playing the flute and the lyre respectively in the sculptural group discovered in a cultic niche near Buyukale. The monument is dated at the end of the 7th or the beginning of the 6th century BC, and may well be the earliest image of the Phrygian goddess accompanied by 2 divine attendants. It is also an attestation that her cult was characterized by music, albeit of a less orgiastic type compared to the music later known to the Greeks. 14. Nevertheless, it is impossible to be sure about the legitimacy of this identification, since the iconography of the figure does not contain any of those elements which distinguish the image of Cybele after the 6th century. Indeed, the triadic pattern of the goddess with 2 attendants is extremely widespread. It can be connected also with the iconography of Cybele in different times and in different situations, with specific details which cannot here be illustrated but which do not coincide with the type of monument in question. 1. Equally hypothetical is the identification of Cybele, with the figure with the tall polos represented in a bas-relief from Ankara, which goes back to the 6th century BC, suggested by R. Temiser. Nor, finally, are the arguments, primarily of a linguistic nature, used by Barnett to illustrate the continuity between the mythical Phrygian complex referring to Cybele and Attis as it was, received by the Greeks and the Anatolian traditions, either completely convincing or always sufficiently documented. However this may be, we must keep in mind the highly composite context in which the figure of the great mother Cybele was undoubtedly situated at the time when the Greeks from Asia learnt to know and revere her. From within this context the Greeks of Asia chose a number of elements which they carried to their homeland, and to the Western colonies 19, thus building a divine image and a cult which bear clear and deep signs of Hellenization. The extent of this Hellenization can be at least partially perceived if we examine the cult of the mother of the gods in classical Greece. The currents of Cybele's religiosity which start to come to the surface in certain circles in the Hellenistic age, and then the late forms of the myth and the ritual in the Roman Empire which appeal explicitly to the Phrygian tradition. 20. The reason for the differences, often considerable, between these various religious expressions could perhaps be sought in the transformations which the cult of the goddess underwent under Greek influence, an influence which is particularly deep and decisive in certain periods and circles, but which recedes at other moments in the face of genuinely Phrygian components. Yet, because of the difficulty of assessing precisely the original consistency of these components, we must appeal to them with the utmost caution. From a methodological point of view, the ideal approach is historical. Aware of the variety and complexity of the elements which compose the cult of Cybele, we could then tackle directly the available documentation in order to define its specific peculiarities in the course of its development in time and space. For the time being, however, we must first see whether mystic aspects and soteriological prospects actually exist, and assess their effect on the general context of the cult of the Great Mother. I shall here be using the term soteriology in a broad sense, to mean the mass of benefits and guarantees which the worshipper expected from the celebration of the cult of Cybele. A detailed analysis of the documentation relating to the various periods and circles in which that cult was practiced should clarify the specific quality of these benefits and allow us to ascertain whether they are limited to man's condition on earth, or whether they also extend to his future life. In this study, I shall use the term mystic in a very specific sense, to characterize certain aspects and modes of the mythical ritual complex gravitating round the Phrygian goddess. I shall base myself on that meaning of the term which on the one hand takes into account its historical origin and the semantic root connecting it with, and on the other embraces a wide religious historical typology exceeding the confines of the Greek world with which the term itself is linguistically connected. If μ sigma tau ta kappa is the adjective referring to that particular religious form constituted in Greece by the μ sigma torhoio talpha, of which Eleusis is the best known and most complex type, it can express the various aspects peculiar to such a structure. That is the ritual esoteric initiatory component and the specific content, the latter viewed in the light of both the character of the divine being object of the cult and of the particular relationship which develops between deity and worshipper. In order to give a still more flexible definition of a religious historical typology, I shall use the term mystery to define that structure in its entirety. I shall reserve the term mystic, on the other hand, for a broader category of religious phenomena, in which we can detect precise analogies with that aspect of the mysteries which concerns the particular type of divinity worshipped and the quality of the relationship created between the divinity and the worshipper, an aspect which, together with the initiatory esoteric institution, characterizes such religious phenomena. So, if the term mystery defines a mythical ritual complex of the elusus type, in the organic interaction of all its aspects, precedence is given in this definition to the ritual component, with initiation and esotericism, practiced within a sanctuary by a specialized body of priests, which would appear to be wholly peculiar to the term mystic can then be used to define those cults which both inside and outside the Greek world do not necessarily present an esoteric initiatory structure, but are centered round a superhuman figure with characteristics which are substantially analogous to the god of the mysteries, and tend to give rise to a type of relationship between man and deity similar to the one established in the mystery. Here, in fact, the nature of the god and the situation of man appear to be intimately connected in a special relationship, so that the condition of the worshipper is defined in virtue of his participation in a cult which celebrates the vicissitude of the deity. Religious historical analysis, however, can indeed distinguish between these two elements and define on the one hand the type of the mystic god, and on the other the type of a mystical experience, or rather of an experience religiously defined within the cult which entails an interaction between the human level and the divine one analogous in its modes and aims to that brought into being by the mystery cult. This interaction is characterized in particular by the sense of familiarity between the worshipper and the deity, based on a similarity of experience, on a sympathia, since man participates through the rite in the pathos of the divine vicissitude. The distinction between mystery and mystic, and the conjunction in the latter of the objective element, constituted by the particular quality of the deity celebrated in the cult as the god's subject of vicissitude, and the subjective element concerning the specific character of the religious experience achieved in this cult, is particularly useful for the analysis of the mythical ritual complex of Cybele, a remarkably composite phenomenon with different manifestations in time and space. While the earliest testimonies concerning the cult of the Great Mother sometimes attest to her association with a nocturnal one and a mountain-to environment, they emphasize above all the presence of songs and the sounds of sacred instruments which were liable to arouse a state of sacred exaltation in the celebrants. If the Homeric hymn to the Mother of the Gods shows us the goddess enjoying the copper humacron tau lambda omeganu tau epsilon pinu omeganu tau alphachi sigmanu tau epsilon beta hum omicron alpha lambda nu, the other sources from Pindar 4 to Diogenes Tragicus 5 and Euripides 6 provide a lively description of her cult celebrated by groups largely of women, to the sound of cymbals, crotala and tambourines in an atmosphere of the utmost religious enthusiasm. As far as the nature and quality of the cult of Cybele in the classical period is concerned, however, Euripides' report in the Bacchae is particularly significant since the rites of the Great Mother Cybele appear to be intimately associated with the Dionysiac ones, likewise called Rogamyotalpha. The relevance of the term Rogamyotalpha, and of the religiosity which it expresses to the mystic cults does not need to be demonstrated. Suffice it to recall that, while in its broader sense it means rites, sacrifices, the Homeric hymn to Demeter refers to founded by the goddess in both the passages where there is an explicit mention of the very special relationship which establishes itself between Demeter and the center of her cult in Eleusis 8, in virtue of the dramatic vicissitude to which she was subjected together with her daughter. The use of Rogamyotalpha to designate the Eleusinian rites, the mu epsilon sigmator hoiotalpha par excellence, continues also at a later period. From Euripides 9 to Aristophanes 10, and to the epigram of the Hierophant Glaucus who recalls having shown Rogamyotalpha, pisigmyotanu, better humicron to omicron, phi alpha epsiloniota sigmamu better humicron to alpha. In Herodotus the term in question alternates with to denote the rites celebrated at Samothrace. At all events we see that in the course of the 5th century the term acquires an ever more precise meaning, being applied preferably to ritual complexes of a cathartic type 13, or to cults with a reserved or frankly esoteric character. Thus, for example, Herodotus speaks of the Rogamyotalpha of Demeter Achaean, whose sanctuary and cult were reserved for the Gephyreans, the other Athenians being excluded. Aristophanes calls the Thesmophoric festivals, typically esoteric rites exclusively reserved for women, and he uses the same term to define the rites of the Muses 16, which Strabo was later to associate with the cults of Dionysus, Apollo, Hecate and Demeter.
As those to whom were due Tyriastican Pangav, to Vachikan, Kafs, Porigan Kaf, to Bereti, Teletis, Mystikon, the Kaipta.
Finally, the Sigma Epsilon Munu Rogamyotalpha of the Thracian goddess Kotito are evoked in Aeschylus's Edonians as rites celebrated in a context of extreme religious enthusiasm, to the sound of timpana and bull roarers. 8. In fact, the term in question is used as early as the 5th century, preferably to denote the Dionysiac rites characterized by similar manifestations of enthusiastic religiosity. It thus assumes a precise meaning, indicating a ritual complex which takes place under the sign of divine mu alpha nu alpha, expressed in dances, songs and sounds of sacred instruments. Such is the picture offered by Euripides' tragedy which, quite apart from the problems of interpretation which it entails, undoubtedly provides a lively view of Dionysiac religiosity and practices. It is of interest to us here since, in a moment of decisive importance for the understanding of the religious historical significance of that religiosity and cultic practice, the divine Bacchos is connected, on a mythical and ritual level, with the Phrygian Great Mother. Such a connection, already familiar to Pindar and emphasized elsewhere by Euripides himself, is a fairly constant item in the Cybele tradition, both in the Greek world and in the Latin West. Without wishing to overestimate the testimony of Euripides, we can nevertheless claim that the poet reflected a real situation when he presented his spectators with the orgia of Cybele as a religious form profoundly similar to the Bacchic rites. Therefore, even if the rites of Cybele do not constitute the primary object of the tragedy, the intimate relationship which unites them, in the general perspective of the work, to the Dionysiac religion permits us to attribute to them certain specific features of this religion. This applies above all to the long choral passage which opens the dramatic action presenting the new religious message carried by the Thyasos led by the divine. Festugiera's penetrating analysis has brought to light a typically liturgical structure in this parodos, in the meter, the language, and in the religious content. It is a hymn to the god which proclaims his nature, the epsilon rum alpha tau alpha, and above all the benefits obtainable from the practice of his cult. It is here that we find also that association with the figure of Cybele which effectively applies to the entire complex of the Dionysiac phenomenon as defined in the parodos itself. The Thyasos and the god who inspires it come from the land of Asia, from the hallowed Tmolus, a region sacred to the Great Mother, already evoked by Dionysus himself in connection with the sacred instruments wielded by the Bacchae. Shortly afterwards she is introduced as the object of the Bacchic cult in the exhilarating Macarismos which proclaims the
Finis of man who, happy as the gods and divinely favored with blessedness teletistan, eth favored with blessedness egestevi καθιασεύει ψυχάν, νερesi βακχεύων εσείς καθαρμόρσιν, τάτε μάτρες, μεγάλης αργιά κυβέλας, θεμητεύων, εννέι θύρσον τετινάστον χιστού, τε στεφάνωθες Διόνυσον θεραπεύει.
Together with Festugiera we should note the specific relevance of the language used here to the sphere of the mystery cults, to the announcement of the worshipper's happiness, which has an obvious parallel in the Eleusinian lambda b Omicron. We can add the reference to the immediate knowledge emerging from the experience of seeing, so typical of those cults, to which the designation of the rites as tau epsilon lambda epsilon to alpha, and the insistence on their cathartic aspect also refer. The Bacchic cult, described in its specific details, is at the same time an expression of mother's religiosity, since the thetepsilon wiota tau epsilon iotanu, the orgy of Cybele, is parallel to the iotanu thetepsilon rho alpha p epsilon epsilon. The common provenance of the two deities from the Asiatic areas, the common invention and possession of musical instruments intended to arouse the sacred mania are further elements which characterize the whole and point to the substantial homogeneity of the two cults. The bliss promised to whomever performs the rite of the Bacchants on the mountains with sacred purifications is an internal condition. It is the acquisition of a status religiously defined and expressed by the image of becoming inwardly a member of a thyasis, which implies a sacred life holy and pure. In its typical enthusiastic orgiastic forms, the ritual experience achieves that interaction between the divine and human levels via the cosmos, which is one of the aspects peculiar to the mystic sphere. The Dionysiac cult, in the early form of the Thyassoi described by Euripides, and the cult of Cybele do not imply the re-evocation of a divine vicissitude, but rather the participation of the adept in a rite which puts him, through the sacred possession to which he yields submissively, in immediate relationship with the deity. This relationship, expressed in the Dionysiac context by the presence of the term beta kappa chi omicron to define the adept and his god, is perceptible in the cult of Cybele in the denomination kappa beta eta beta omicron conferred on the man possessed by the mother of the gods. The capacity to infuse sacred mania is in fact one of the specific prerogatives of the great Phrygian goddess, from Euripides who, in Hippolytus, evokes the amongst the deities capable of rendering man, to Menander where, in connection with the experience of the, we have an allusion to the obsession affected by the mother of the gods, up to the late lexicographers who record the word, and say that the very name of the goddess, in the form, is derived pi tau omicron nu theta omicron upsilon sigma tau phi sigma mu omicron, which the goddess causes in the initiates. The sources unanimously emphasize this faculty of Cybele. The theme of the inflicted by the goddess as the punishment of an impious attitude on the part of man characterizes the vicissitudes of Menander and Sagaris as they are recounted by the pseudo-Plutarch. The same author says that the goddess drove Scamander mad by appearing to him during the celebration of the rite, An identical effect was produced on those performing the rites of Cybele by the side of the stone called, which is found on Mount Berecynthius, sacred to the mother of the gods, since it takes its name from the first of her priests. Cybele, however, liberates whomever turns to her from the madness contracted by contact with the Sigma Firhu Meganu herb, which grows in the waters of the meander. All these accounts are connected with the basic theme of possession as a condition characteristic of the cult of Cybele, and which induced and sought in the ritual context can appear outside it, as a terrible punishment inflicted by the goddess. Moreover, this theme in its double significance defines the entire mythical vicissitude experienced by Attis, in its Phrygian version, and the ritual complex of the Galli, to which I shall be returning later. For the time being we should observe that, apart from that mythical ritual complex which does not appear in the sources of the classical period, the personality of the Phrygian meter and her cult seem, in these sources, to be decisively characterized by the motif of divine possession which constitutes one of the aspects of the mystic sphere. The connection with the Dionysiac sphere which seems to absorb the religion of Cybele entirely in Euripides' tragedy, is therefore revealing. It is to this religion that we can probably attribute, at least in the consciousness of the poet and his spectators, those soteriological prospects announced by the chorus in the urgent invitation to the city of Thebes to participate in the bet alpha kappa chi epsilon mu alpha tau alpha. These prospects consist, as we have seen, in reaching a state of inner bliss achieved through the practice of a cult with strongly cathartic connotations which entails a pure life and membership of a religious community. That condition of intimate happiness which characterizes the true member of the thyasis is then attained within this community. There is no eschatological projection of the epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron u alpha of the Bacchante in Euripides' text. Admittedly, the famous inscription from Cumae which forbids burial in the place indicated epsilon mu epsilon tanu beta epsilon beta alpha chi chi psilon epsilon mu nu omicronu, and above all the golden lemina of Hipponion, in which alpha kappa are evoked to leave in glory along the sacred path which leads to the abode of the blessed, clearly attest the existence of a link between the condition of the Bacchante and the prospect of an afterlife. Nevertheless, these are documents from that Magna Graecia where, thanks to Orphic and Pythagorean ideologies, preoccupation with the future life of the soul were felt especially keenly. In all probability they reflect the concepts of Dionysiac circles strongly influenced by Orphism. Euripides himself refers to a circle of this type in the fragment of the Cretans, which combines in a single complex perspective the cult of Zeus Idios, the thunderbolts of Zagreus who wanders by night, and the torches wielded for the mother Repsilon Alpha. Also in this context the poet insists on the purity of life of the believer, here called an initiate as well as, but the reference to the white robes to the rejection of procreation and of, as well as the prohibition to have any contact with graves, clearly illustrates a religiosity of an Orphic type which cannot be lumped together with the Dionysiac worship of the Thiasoi, or the cult of Cybele which Euripides so frequently assimilates with it. Such testimonies, therefore, do not entitle us to claim that the Dionysiac cult of the classical period invariably included the idea of future bliss for the believer which no other contemporary sources mention. We can consequently accept Festugiera's conclusion that the efficacy of the Dionysiac cult was limited to the ritual act, and that the benefits obtained by the Bacchante consisted in reaching the state of divine possession, in the liberating joy of music and ecstatic dances. We are all the more entitled to apply a definition of this type to the cult of Cybele, so close to the Dionysiac religion of the Thiasoi in its orgiastic manifestations, since no source allows us to presuppose the existence of eschatological prospects for the worshipper. As for the procedure of the rite, even if the evidence examined allows us to recognize its mystic quality, there are no elements which reveal any initiatory and esoteric structure amongst the groups practicing the orgiastic cult of Cybele. If we turn once again to the Dionysiac milieu, as to the phenomenon which offers the most specific analogies with that cult, we will see that, despite the presence in Euripides' tragedy of some indications pointing to a broadly initiatory practice in the Bacchic Thiasoi, there is no sign of the structure typical of the mysteries which includes a definite center of the cult, a series of ritual acts intended for the religious qualification of the adept, and the specific esotericism which protects this ritual practice. With regard both to the Dionysiac worship of the Thiasoi and the orgia of Cybele, it would be better to speak of a seclusion which protects those groups who celebrate the cult of the god, or rather of the Great Mother, in a state of mystic exaltation from the indiscreet curiosity of the non-participants. Chapter 2. Mysteries in the Hellenized Cult of Cybele. The highly individual esotericism and above all the specifically mystic connotation of the ritual of Cybele can account for the use, in certain later sources, of an obviously mystery terminology to designate it. A scholium of the Hellenistic period to Pindar's third Pythian ode explains the term nonukia talpha, used by the poet, by the fact that the mysteries are performed at night in honor of the goddess. The same scholiast, recalling the episode of the foundation of the little temple dedicated by Pindar to the mother of the gods, says that in it the goddess is honored with Equally, the scholiast of Sophocles Philoctetes comments on the term by which the Gaia one who feedest all is invoked, saying that her mysteries are performed on the mountains. The mountain setting and the nocturnal character of the cult are the two elements which are stressed in these sources that define the rites of Cybele as. While they confirm the mystic connotation of such rites, however, they add no new elements to the picture which emerges from the earliest testimonies. The mountainous and nocturnal context of the goddess mysteries actually reminds us of the cult of Cybele known to the sources of the 5th century BC. The terms to epsilon lam de epsilon to alpha and mu epsilon sigma tor hoya to alpha are applied to it without implying a reference to a ritual complex of an Eleusinian type. In other words, to a religious institution tied to a sanctuary and organized according to the initiatory esoteric scheme. It is in this sense that we could interpret the allusion to the who frequent the Dindymon in an ode in the Anthologia Palatina, but it does not seem right to attribute to the term the technical meaning of initiates, since the text in question evokes the orgiastic cult of the goddess, celebrated to the sound of cymbals, flutes, and tympana, in the typical condition of mu-alpha and u-alpha. Nevertheless, some sources of the Hellenistic period attest the existence of religious associations organized according to a structure of a mystery type who practiced the cult of the Great Mother. An inscription from Troezen, which can be dated in the second half of the 3rd century BC, mentions that is those who perform initiation, or the Mystae of the Great Mother. At Argos, a heavily mutilated inscription of uncertain date records a Capio Micronio Tanunu Tanum Upsilon Sigma Tanu in connection with the Mother of the Gods. The community of the initiates has a priest for life and assembles in its Thetherhota Sigma Kappa Epsilon Alpha various deities whose identity is unknown to us. Mention is also made of a garden and a dwelling, the object of the donation to the community recorded in the document. Again, a decree of Minoa of Amorgos, dated in the 1st century BC, provides some interesting information about the performance of the cult of Cybele, reorganized after the intervention of a certain Hegezerete. The festival as a whole is called MPA and in it, besides ceremonies of a public nature and banquets, initiatory rites were also celebrated. A priestess is mentioned whose duty it was to perform the teat, or, as emerges from the context, the initiation, and we see that the tepsilon lam davak, that is the sacrificial offering paid by the initiates, was considered sacred, o pepsilon alphano munu epsilon p tanu tau omega sigma. Further on we read of the price of the initiation. We know that at Eleusis, as in other mysteries, the candidates had to give a certain sum to the priests in charge of the initiation. The existence of this obligation in the ritual illustrated by the inscription in question confirms the fact that the cult of the Mother of the Gods had assumed at Minoa the institutionalized form of the mysteries insofar as they were rites implying an initiation regulated by precise norms and guaranteed by persons sacramentally qualified. A striking feature is that the performance of the priestly function is entrusted to a woman who practices the text. We should finally recall the Hellenistic bas relief from Lebedeia, which provides us with a scene of undoubtedly mystery connotation. The reference to the cult is expressed in the 4 figures of worshippers, who, in accordance with the conventions of Greek art, are represented in reduced proportions on the extreme right-hand side of the marble slab, near a large table on which stand unidentifiable objects. The figures, lined up facing outwards in a continuous series which ends on the left with the image of Cybele, seated on a throne in profile and flanked by the lion, are on a larger scale and can undoubtedly be identified as deities characterized by special attributes. The Dioscuri with the typical pileus are followed by 3 corybantas with broad shields, then comes a bearded figure, bare to the waist with cornucopia and snakes, beside whom is a young woman with 2 long torches. Pan comes next, playing the syrinx, and then Dionysus, recognizable from the Thyrsus, leading by the hand a veiled figure who is also being led, on the right, by a woman with a large key which allows us to identify a priestess with initiatory functions. The interpretation of the scene as the presentation of a Mysts to the Great Mother is confirmed by the detail of his being veiled, a detail which recurs in the Greek mystery cults. We can agree with M.P. Nilsson in seeing in the relief of Lebedeia the transposition on a divine level of an initiatory ritual as it recurs in the Eleusinian milieu in relation to the initiations of Heracles and the Dioscuri, even though we know nothing of the existence of a corresponding myth in connection with Cybele. What should now be emphasized is the presence of an initiatory practice in this cult which, as far as we can see from the multiple divine associations, maintains the orgiastic characteristics typical of the mystic forms already analyzed, even if we also have new figures. Although we have noted the adoption by the cult of Cybele in the Hellenistic period of institutional elements of a mystery type, in a sense typologically analogous to the mysteries of Eleusis, we cannot provide any solution to the problem of possible guarantees offered to the initiate by the practice of the cult itself. The few documents in our possession, which I have analyzed above, do not contain any elements which might point to such a solution. Even if we are entitled to formulate the hypothesis that, by establishing a closer degree of familiarity between the initiate and the goddess, the mystery cult procured for the initiate certain special benefits, It would not be correct from a methodological point of view to say anything about the nature of these benefits of which we do not even know the exact consistency. Still less does the existence of Cybele's mysteries entitle us to project the guarantees and special benefits possibly offered to the initiate into an eschatological perspective. A procedure of this sort would imply the identification of the form of the mysteries with the Eleusinian rites to which the eschatological perspective is fundamental, in the context of a cult which also guarantees an abundance of goods and a security in this world. The principal obstacle would seem to me to be the circumstance that a cultic complex which cannot be denied the character of mysteries such as that of Samothrace, familiar enough to us from literary and monumental testimonies which illustrate its secular history, does not appear to provide any specifically eschatological prospects. The soteriology connected to the cult of the megaloi theoi of Samothrace does indeed entail a safeguard against dangers, and particularly against dangers from the sea, but it can also be expressed in Diodorus's formula, according to which the initiates simply thought they would become more pious and more just, and better from every point of view. This is confirmed, moreover, by the formula of the dedicatory inscriptions, a large number of which have been found in the sanctuary of Samothrace, where the Mystai call themselves Eusebies or Pii. The benefit obtained by the initiation was not subject to the esoteric prohibition of being divulged, on the contrary, as is attested by Eleusis itself. It constituted the main argument in favor of the religious propaganda of the mystery cults. It would consequently be hard to explain why the documents do not retain any trace of an eschatological prospect at Samothrace, if the mysteries celebrated there had actually offered one. In any case, judging from the sources which have come down to us, we must admit that one of the earliest Greek religious complexes, which displays the esoteric initiatory structure of the mysteria and which probably entailed the ritual re-evocation of a divine vicissitude, in other words the cult of Samothrace, offers no support to the theory which establishes a necessary and indispensable relationship between the religious form of the mysteries and the existence of an eschatological prospect for the individual. The individual undoubtedly had a specific soteriological prospect, but its details and contents must be studied and defined case by case without undue preconceptions. To return to the cult of Cybele, we can say that in the sources examined hitherto, the Phrygian great goddess has appeared as the sole object of a cult which, although submitted to a more or less deep process of Hellenization, retains certain individual characteristics. It expresses a religiosity of a mystic type which in some cases assumes the institutionalized forms of the mystery. As from the 4th century BC, however, it is possible to follow another line of development of the cult of Cybele, the one connected to the figure of Attis who, albeit of a subordinate status, occupies a religiously significant position together with the goddess. Chapter 3. Mystic aspects in the Phrygian mythical ritual cycle. Attis, the mystic god, and the mythical theme of the androgyne. The relatively late appearance of Attis in Greek sources does not mean that the myth and the ritual connected with him were a late creation, but rather that the Greeks who had come into contact with the cult of Cybele adopted the figure of the great goddess, partially Hellenizing her by assimilating her with Demeter, or more often by identifying her with Rhea, but at first rejected the figure of Attis. For he was at the center of a mythical tradition and of a cultic practice which appeared alien, not to say frankly repugnant, to the Greek mentality of the classical era. Even in the Hellenistic and Roman imperial period, moreover, the practice of eunuchism performed by the Galli who used it as a means of dedicating themselves completely to Cybele met, as we know, with considerable resistance in the Greek and Roman world. Such a practice appears to have been closely connected with the person of Attis from two different but complementary points of view. On the one hand, it had its mythical basis in the act which, according to the so-called Phrygian version, was a prelude to the death of the divine personage. On the other hand, Attis appeared in a vast documentary tradition as the prototype of the Gallus, or rather as the worshipper who celebrates the mystic orgiastic cult of Cybele, and, in a fit of total devotion to the goddess, under the influence of the dedicates his own virility to her. The sources thus present the figure as one who, having betrayed his loyalty to the Great Mother, inflicts a terrible punishment on himself in a state of madness and mutilates himself. This act becomes the mystic alpha to alpha of the cultic practice of the Galli. It is in this light that the episode of Attis is recounted in Ovid's Fasti, where the Phrix puer, who bound the goddess with chaste love when he was living in the woods, did not live up to the absolute devotion and chastity which the goddess demanded of him but went off with the nymph Sangaritis. In a moment of folly, Attis took a sharpened stone and mutilated himself, the mutilation being represented as the punishment deserved by his infidelity. At this point Ovid's report ends, only interested in explaining the behavior of the Galli. Ovid says nothing about the consequences of Attis's gruesome deed. So even if the latter is presented as the prototype of the eunuch of Cybele, it is still not possible to conclude from this source of markedly ideological inspiration that the theme of Attis' death was unknown or that it was introduced into the mythical cycle concerning him after the theme of mutilation by way of a contamination by the myth of Adonis or according to the canons of euhemerism, as Lagrange suggests. The theme in question, moreover, is amply developed in Catullus' 63rd Carmen, where Attis is deprived of all superhuman connotations and simply appears as a devotee of Cybele, who, in an outburst of orgiastic exaltation, performed the brutal mutilation which dedicates him to the goddess irremediably. Even the poems of the Anthologia Palatina often represent the figure of the Gallus overcome by Muelfanuelfa and, in at least one case, Attis appears as the goddess's devoted eunuch her. The myth and the cult of Attis, as we shall see, do not end in the practice of eunuchism, so it is not possible to conclude, as has so often been done, that the mythical complex concerning him has a purely ideological value, the character being no more than the prototype of the Gallus, Cybele's eunuch. At the same time, while such a conclusion proves inadequate because it neglects the other significant aspects of the figure of Attis, it leaves open the problem of the true religious historical meaning of the practice itself, for which the many explanations advanced by scholars are, for various reasons, unsatisfactory. There is no precise evidence for the hypothesis that eunuchism was connected at a late date with the cult of Cybele by the Semitic world, and that a cultic custom originally alien to Attis was transferred onto the mythical level pertaining to him. Nor does it appear very likely in view of the central position adopted by eunuchism in the Phrygian mythical ritual complex. It would seem rather that such a cultic custom was expressing a basic component of this complex. After all, for many centuries it remained unchanged, outside its original ethnic and cultural habitat, retaining its typically archaic procedure. It survived, furthermore, in the face of profound changes in historical and spiritual conditions, and despite the open hostility and contempt of Western environments who regarded it as barbarous and alien to their own religious habits and cultural premises. The requirement of ritual purity achieved in its most definitive and irrevocable form by way of mutilation may indeed have owed a debt to those cathartic preoccupations which are not extraneous to the cult of Cybele, but it does not provide a completely satisfactory explanation for such a singular and violent practice. To interpret it as a rite aimed at promoting the fertility of the earth runs up against several objections. And besides, such an aim, considered outside an organic religious structure which might provide adequate grounds for this type of behavior, hardly justifies the choice of so gruesome a method. The significance of eunuchism in the cult of Attis, then, cannot be explained rationalistically. It can only be understood in the light of the religious context in which the practice has a concrete function and of which, as I said, it is an essential component. We must therefore proceed to a direct examination of this context, in order to establish the position occupied by this particular theme in the mythical and ritual complex gravitating round the figure of Attis. Numerous elements in the sources concerning the myth and the ritual in honor of Attis emphasize the character's profound and multiple connections with a sphere of vegetal fertility. He would therefore come under the category of the so-called fertility gods, significant examples of whom are provided by the mythologies and cults of the Near East, and who appear to be involved variously in an alternating situation of presence and absence. Despite this definition, which recalls Fraser's formula, I do not intend to accept the interpretation of such characters proposed by the English anthropologist insofar as it implies their insertion in a pattern of death and resurrection. I wish rather to emphasize their undoubted connections with the sphere of fertility and their quality as deities typically subject to vicissitude. For similar superhuman figures we can consequently employ a terminology better suited to the methodological premises I outlined at the beginning of this study, and use the definition of mystic gods. They can, after all, be situated typologically in a fairly homogeneous religious historical category, which includes the same divine protagonists of the mystery cults insofar as they too are gods subject to vicissitude. It is hardly necessary, moreover, to stress the chthonic references and the connections with the sphere of fertility in the vicissitude of Demeter and Persephone, as it is celebrated in the Eleusinian mysteries. We must therefore examine the function and significance of Attis in connection with the Cybele's tradition, in order to see whether we are entitled to situate the character in the category of the mystic gods in the sense elucidated above. This is all the more necessary since Lambrex has objected violently to the common definition of Attis as a god of vegetation who dies and rises, and offers his adepts some hope of immortality. If the Belgian scholar's criticism of Fraser's scheme of the dying and rising god is fully acceptable, the same cannot be said of his refusal to acknowledge the originally superhuman nature of Cybele's young Paredros and his connections with the sphere of fertility. According to Lambrex, he was a mere human being, a devotee of the goddess who only achieved a divine rank in the 2nd century AD, when, in order to check the victorious advance of Christianity, he was made into a god who overcomes death. Although I shall develop all my arguments in the course of the present study, I should here point out that one of the elements on which Lambrex bases his interpretation is constituted by the terracottas in the Museum of Istanbul, which come from Cyprus and Kos. They represent a goddess seated on a throne, holding in her lap a child identified with Attis on account of his typically Phrygian headdress. Lambrex, who dates these statuettes approximately in the Roman imperial period, deduces that in this late period, the legend of Attis was still particularly fluid since the character appears neither as a devotee of the goddess nor as a deity equal to her but as a son. This observation seems to contradict Lambrecht's basic hypothesis, according to which Attis was not originally a divinity, but rather a human worshipper of the Great Mother. For if the figure is conceived as the son of the goddess, he clearly leaves the human sphere and enters a divine one. The notion of Attis as the son of Cybele, furthermore, can be situated coherently in the Phrygian mythical version, which recounts the birth of Attis from a girl fecundated by the fruit of a tree born from the blood of the hermaphroditic Aegisthus, and which thus presents the character as the latter's son. This same tradition also specifies Aegisthus' maternal care of the child. On the other hand, the Attis's superhuman nature is in no way impaired by the fact that he does not appear in the sources as a personality of equal rank to the Great Mother. In actual fact, in accordance with the typology of the so-called fertility gods, he is an inferior deity, but connected to Cybele by profound bonds in a relationship at once intimate and ambivalent. A recent exegetical study of the documentation relating to Attis has denied the original and specific nature of his association with fertility. Kolpe, for example, rejects the naturalistic interpretations of the myths concerning Attis suggested by modern authors on the basis of ancient sources which stress the character's vegetal connections. Such sources would seem to have submitted those myths to an interpretation in the light of the physical theory, in other words of the fairly widespread notion in late antiquity of the correspondence between divine entities and natural phenomena. Kolpe bases his own analysis on the mythical version recounted both by Pausanias and Arnobius, and takes the central theme of these accounts to be the myth of the primeval androgyne, with specifically chthonic characteristic. Aegisthus, having lost her bisexuality through mutilation, tends to reacquire it through the connection with Attis, who represents the male counterpart. The crisis of this relationship leads to the mutilation of Attis, which should not be seen as a reduction of the character to a female category, but as a means of overcoming the polarity of the sexes. Castration would thus reconstitute the totality of the primeval androgyne. The principal telluric significance of this mythical theme, which Kolpe deduces from certain details of the account, is expressed in the conclusion according to which Attis and Cybele stehen nicht zur vegetative Fruchtbarkeit, sondern zur tellerischen Erdkraft in Beziehung.
Als deren Manifestation man sich etwa den Magnetismus oder die Strahlungen vorstellen kann, welche die alten Prospektoren das Wasser oder das Erz im Stein finden ließen.
Aside from the psychological elements stressed in the mythical complex in question, Kolpe, of course, is proposing a physical interpretation more radical than the one in the ancient sources and, to some degree, than the one in the modern literature on the subject. But be that as it may, we shall now proceed to a direct analysis of the mythical and ritual traditions of Attis, for this alone can authorize a religious historical definition of the personality in question. After having related Hermesianax's statement containing the so-called Lydian version of the myth of Attis, Pausanias introduces a different account which in his own words constituted the PHRYGIAN Omicron Lambda Gamma Omicron of Pausanias. The parallel but far more extensive account in Arnobius confirms the close connection between this second mythical version and the city sacred to the Mother of the Gods. It also reveals its own status as a sacred discourse within the cult of Pausanias. No doubt the account given by Arnobius is the product of various stratifications and elaborations whose sources and age cannot be identified with any certainty. In any case, the attempt to confer a Hellenized garb on the myth is perfectly obvious with the introduction of characters like Themis, Pyrrha, and Deucalion, and Dionysus Liber. Nevertheless, it retains certain authentically Phrygian features which emerge from a comparison with other sources and which were due above all to its close connections with the ritual practice, usually more stable and conservative compared to the sometimes even considerable variations in the mythical accounts. It should first be pointed out that Pausanias's account only has the figure of Aegisthus as the protagonist of the vicissitude directly involving Attis, while Arnobius also presents the character of the Great Mother next to Aegisthus. The Great Mother occupies a position which would seem on the one hand to be parallel to that of Aegisthus, but on the other she displays a superior dignity and authority, appearing as an attentive supervisor of the entire vicissitude. It is not easy to appreciate the religious historical significance of this double divine presence in the religious complex in question, unless we interpret it as a straightforward doubling of the character of the Great Mother, possibly due to the Hellenizing mythographer's intention to safeguard, in the crudity of the episode narrated, the dignity of the Mother of the Gods from the barbarous and coarse aspects of the hermaphrodite Aegisthus. Indeed, the figure of Aegisthus occupied a special position in the traditions connected with the Cybele's religion. If, as we know, some literary and epigraphic sources identify the meter theon with Aegisthus, presenting the latter name as her epithet, others prefer to distinguish between the two characters, mentioning the one next to the other in the same context.
Thus an inscription from Iconium invokes, ten de vogdistin. Και ten mitera voithenen, και ten mitera among the gods regarded as Soteris.
Apollo and Artemis. Of particular interest is an altar from Sisma, a village of Lycaonia situated near Iconium and Laodicea, whose four faces bear reliefs representing deities and inscriptions. While sides A and C have dedications to Apollo Sozon and to Helios, side B has the inscription Gamma Delta Iota Sigma Iota Pisci, accompanied by a heavily damaged relief with the figure of horseman. On side D, near the front view of a figure on a throne, we read the dedication. The epithet of Zizimene is frequently used to designate the Great Mother in various centers of Asia Minor. According to Ramsey, it is a dialectal form of Dindymene. However that may be, in at least one case the Mother of the Gods is explicitly called Zizimene. Consequently, the altar of Sisma represents the Great Mother and Agdistis as separate characters. In many more cases Agdistis appears alone. In addition to a figurative stele with an inscription from the Piraeus, she is mentioned in Greece at Rhamnus, where she had a sanctuary of her own. We have a dedication from Methymna, and we read the name on a marble base found at Paros, ascribable to the 2nd century BC. The same island has yielded a dedication, while a marble stele, also of the 2nd century BC, records a dedicated to the Phrygian goddess. The island of Paros was therefore a center of the cult of Cybele. The Phrygian aspects of this cult were heavily accentuated, but it is impossible to tell whether the mother of the gods received the name of Agdistis, or whether she was considered, as in the mythical version familiar to Arnobius, a character at least partially separate from her. At Pantikapeum there was a dedication which Pyupsilon Sigmalpha Pirho Tanu Theta Gamalfarhu Miganu Kapalpha Rosigma, Gamma Gamma Epsilon Iota Nuthete Takape Epsilon, while in Egypt the priest Mochos, in the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, records the erection of a naos with its temenos. There are also numerous mentions of Agdistis on her own in the inscriptions of the city of Midas, although they are all fairly late. At Kandira, on the Black Sea, an inscription from the Antonine period placed on a small altar contains the dedication of a Synodos. Another inscription from Virankoi, heavily mutilated, contains the words Epsilon Noodle to Sigma Sigma Iota. There are some far earlier documents, on the other hand, which come from various localities in Asia Minor. The Decree of Philadelphia, which contains a number of ritual prescriptions for a religious community which venerated numerous gods, goes back to the 2nd or early 1st century BC. The community was based at the sanctuary of Agdistis, defined as Alpha Kappa of the sacred dwelling and the guarantor of the prescriptions themselves. In one of the votive bas-reliefs of the series studied by Conze, in which the meter is attended by 2 male figures, one young, the other bearded, the representation of the deities is accompanied by an inscription of the 3rd century BC, in which Kale reads the dative. Finally, we have an inscription from Sardis, recently published by Robert, who recognized it as the copy of a decree issued in the 4th century BC by the Persian governor of the city, in which there is mention of the mysteries of Agdistis amongst the rites which the priests of Zeus are forbidden to attend. The name of Agdistis, as a specific denomination of the deity connected with the mythical ritual cycle of Piscinus, was therefore quite well known in various parts of Asia Minor and the Greek mainland and islands, at least as far back as the 4th century BC. It is not possible to establish whether this implied a specific acquaintance with that religious complex, including the peculiar theme of the character's originally hermaphroditic nature, or whether the name of Agdistis only appeared as one of many epithets of the great goddess whom the Hellenized world worshipped primarily with the title of Mater Theon. Indeed, the latter has various features in common with the Agdistis of Pessinus, such as the capacity to inspire Mulfenu-alpha and the connection with Attis, but she also differs from her precisely where that aspect of her nature is concerned. On the other hand, the theme of the divine androgyne is present too, in other Phrygian religious traditions. We can probably accept the conclusion of Guzmani, who sees in Agdistis the gray-sized form of the Phrygian name of a primeval androgyne, whose figure was partially superimposed at Pessinus on the one, with very different origins, of the great goddess. This appears all the more likely in view of the fact that, in the myth of Pessinus, the androgyny of Agdistis does not express the notion of plenitude, but rather of disorder and confusion. It can thus be associated with the theme, recurrent in so many cosmogonical contexts in Greece and the Near East, of the chaotic and violent, origins in which entities as yet amorphous and semi-personal, archai rather than deities clearly defined in their nature and functions, act. This conclusion would seem to be confirmed by a more recent investigation performed by Foth, starting from a Kouré ritual text which contains the name of Kubaba accompanied by that of Adama, and basing himself on linguistic and etymological considerations, he succeeded in recognizing in the latter the name of an ancient Anatolian deity with features both paternal and maternal. Foth concluded that the document in question does indeed confirm the presence in Anatolia of a divine maternal entity with androgynous connotations, but also provides an attestation of the process by which the goddess Kubaba, on entering Anatolia, was partially assimilated with this entity and assumed its name as an epiclesis. We cannot deny the value of studies of this type, even if it must be pointed out that the linguistic element does not exhaust all the aspects of a deity and its religious context. It would consequently be as well to avoid any definite conclusion about the religious historical meaning of a mythical or cultic figure based exclusively on etymological evidence. As far as we are concerned, this form of research can help us to interpret a figure like Aegisthus and her complex myth, revealing the interaction of various elements and layers. Besides, if the observations made by the scholars quoted are correct, the distinction established by Arnobius and other sources between the character of Aegisthus and that of the great goddess shows that the same religious tradition had maintained some trace of the original diversity of the deities in question, or at least of the specific peculiarities of each one. In any case, as we shall see from a direct examination of the accounts in Pausanias and Arnobius, the significance of the deities and their cult goes way beyond the theme of the primeval androgyne, which would appear to be no more than a single component of a far more complex and flexible picture. We read then that Attis was the son of Nana, the daughter of the king or the river Sangarius, who had deposited in her womb the fruit of a tree, an almond or a pomegranate, which had sprung in its turn from earth fertilized by the blood of Aegisthus. The vegetal and chthonic connections of the episode are emphasized by the circumstances of the birth of the hermaphrodite Aegisthus from the earth or from a rock, fecundated by a heavenly being. The youthful mother of Attis is rejected by her father, imprisoned and starved, but the mother of the gods looks after her and feeds her with the fruits of a pomegranate and other provisions. Later on, Arnobius himself says that these were acorns and figs. Aegisthus, reduced by mutilation to femininity, takes care of Attis, who is fed on goat's milk, and grows up in the mountains amongst the beasts of the woods given by the goddess to her protege. Arnobius's version attributes to the mother of the gods the same love for Attis. The familiarity between the two characters comes to an end when the king of Finis decides to give his daughter in marriage to the youth. When Aegisthus appears in a fury at the wedding ceremony and drives the guests mad, the setting of the myth presents a series of obvious references to the naturalistic environment and, particularly, to the sphere of arborescent and fluorescent vegetation. Attis, in a fit of mania, castrates himself under a pine tree and dies. From his blood spring the violets which surround the tree.
Arnobius, who gives us these details, notes that indinatum et ortumis nunc etiam sacras velari et coronari pinos.
The practice of the rite, based as it is on the myth, thus confirms the vegetal connections of the character and his vicissitude. After having wrapped his body in strips of wool and celebrated the funeral dirge, Attis's bride also dies. Further on, Arnobius, returning to the various episodes of the Phrygian myth in order to give a polemical emphasis to its unseemly and absurd features, adds another detail. Before she died, the girl cut off her breast. We thus have a mutilation parallel to that of Attis as the prelude to death. Purple violets also spring from the blood of the girl, and, after she has been buried by the mother of the gods, her tomb gives birth to the almond trees. The behavior of the goddess also recalls the ritual practice. She takes into her dwelling the tree beneath which Attis died, and sociatus planctibus cum agdesti tundit et sociat pectus positae circum arboris robur. The reference to the March ceremonies connected with the cutting of the pine, to its ritual treatment as the symbol of dead Attis, and to its introduction into the sanctuary of Cybele where it was the object of funeral dirges, is obvious. The Phrygian authenticity of this ceremony, as it emerges from the testimonies which we shall return to later, entitles us to reach certain precise conclusions of a religious historical character concerning the nature of the divine protagonists of the myth and the cult, independently of any reservation about the physical interpretation of mythographers and ancient theologians. The episode ends with Aegisthus's request to Zeus to have Attis return to life. The request is not granted, but the youth's body is saved from dissolution. His hair will continue to grow, and his little finger will be in constant motion. Appeased by this concession, Aegisthus dedicated the body to Finis with annual ceremonies, and honored it with priestly orders. In the somewhat strange and crude complexity of its details, the myth here recounted helps to elucidate the multiple chthonic and vegetal connections of the religious complex of Cybele, the character of the superhuman personalities in action, and the significance of the rite which appeals to the mythical vicissitude. Aegisthus, born from a rock or from the earth, is a divine being expressing the savage violence of the forces of nature, unbounded and uncontrolled, while the mutilation of this hermaphroditic figure defines her nature by concentrating and normalizing her fertilizing capacities in a manner which is no longer destructive and unbridled. It gives rise at the same time to a vegetal element typically charged with a vital force. Aegisthus's connection with fertility is further emphasized by the extraordinary circumstances of the birth of Attis, generated by the fertilizing power of the fruit of the tree produced by the earth in the manner described. Attis's vegetal connections, on the other hand, are stressed both by the circumstances of his birth and by those of his death. We should also note that, as in the so-called Lydian version of the myth, so too in the Phrygian one which we have examined, the conclusion of the vicissitude is tragic. The goddess responsible for the dramatic epilogue of the episode is the first, moreover, to begin the dirge round the tree which commemorates the death of Attis. Unlike the Lydian version, however, the accounts of Pausanias and Arnobius contain an attempt to modify this doleful conclusion by reviving Attis. Although this does not actually take place, a form of survival after death is indeed accorded to him. His body does not decay, and his hair continues to grow while a finger remains in motion. a sign that Attis is not completely dead. So if we cannot talk of the youth's return to life or resurrection, the mythical tradition attested by the two authors has an outcome which, even if it is characterized by pathos and by mourning, guarantees a positive prospect for Attis, since he is saved from complete annihilation. In this manner the youth obtains a subsistence beyond death, or rather what we would be entitled to call a subsistence in death. The presence of Cybele's young paredros in the religious practice is also guaranteed by the annual repetition of the rite, in which the vicissitude is commemorated with ceremonies directly connected with the essential moments of the myth. Attis's vegetal connections. Before we come to these ceremonies, both in their public aspect and in their private or truly mystery aspect, we should cast a glance at other testimonies which stress Attis's connection with arborescent and fluorescent vegetation. This will enable us to confirm the pertinency of the character with all his peculiar features, to the category of those superhuman figures whose vicissitude of presence and absence can be seen as a support and divine guarantee of the alternating rhythm of vegetation. The stability typical of the great goddess, on the other hand, expresses rather the substantial immutability of fertile nature, beyond periodic change and seasonal alteration. Even the quality of the relationship between Attis and the great goddess confirms these conclusions. It is a typically ambivalent relationship, of love and benevolence on the one hand, but on the other a source of destruction for the young paredros. This is how it appears both in the Lydian version of the myth, according to which Attis is killed by the boar set onto him by Zeus, jealous of the preference which Cybele displays for the young man, and in the Phrygian version, in which the jealous and possessive love of Aegisthus entails the death of the character whom she is then the first to bewail. A similar significance is assumed by the vicissitude of Attis in the euhemeristic version known to Diodorus Siculus. Despite the essentially humanized setting in which the characters move, their principal features and their multiple and fundamental connections with the sphere of nature, both animal and chthonic, do indeed emerge. The mountainous setting, inhabited by beasts and shepherds with their flocks, shows up a fundamental aspect of the personality of Cybele, who, though presented as a girl, receives the typical epithet of, and turns out to be gifted with medical and cathartic powers in relation to the invention of the sacred musical instruments, typical of the orgiastic cult. In the obviously romanticized picture of the marriage of Cybele and Attis Pappus, there emerge the essential components of the myth already known to us. The bond between the two characters turns out to be disastrous for Attis, who is subjected to death. What in the Lydian version was Zeus's jealousy at the evident preference displayed by the goddess for the young devotee, becomes in Diodorus's euhemeristic account of the events the wrath of the king whose vengeance strikes his daughter's clandestine bridegroom. The daughter's reaction to the death of Attis is in keeping with the common mythic tradition, raising loud cries and beating the tympanum. She wandered through the country alone, her hair loose. We therefore have a characteristic theme, that of dearth and plague which afflict the country as the result of Attis's death and the mourning of Cybele. If on the one hand, it is a repetition of the familiar theme of flails which afflict a people marked by the killing of an innocent, on the other we cannot help noticing the coherence of such a theme with the general context of the vicissitude. As the convergence of so much evidence seems to demonstrate, it does indeed fit into the framework of a religiosity of a chthonic type, nature of course, being seen as spontaneous vegetal rhythms or arborescent vegetation, rather than in the Demetrian sense of regular, cultivated agrarian rhythms. At the same time, however, the barrenness which strikes the country as the result of the death of Attis and the departure of Cybele turns out to be comparable to the situation in the analogous episodes of Ishtar Tammuz and Demeter Persephone. In both of these, as we know, the climax of the crisis, characterized by the momentary absence of the great goddess of nature, is marked by an animal and earth sterility which threaten the human race with extinction. In the case of Inanna Ishtar, this is due to the temporary death of the goddess caused by her descent into the infernal regions, or in the case of Demeter, to the voluntary cessation of the functions peculiar to the deity. It is difficult to decide on the Phrygian authenticity of the motif of sterility resulting from the death of Attis and the mourning of Cybele. We cannot exclude, any more than we can for other aspects of the cult of Cybele and its Hellenized forms, an influence of the Demetrian type, all the more likely in view of the complex and elaborate character of Diodorus's version. Even in this second event, however, we must admit that the theme in question fits coherently into the general context of the myth and the Phrygian cult. The disappearance of Attis, provoking the crisis and the removal of the great chthonic goddess from her functions, is directly reflected in the life of the country, which turns out to be seriously affected and threatened by extinction. The character is indeed connected with the great goddess of nature, in an ambiguous manner, even if, in the light of the religious ideology in question, this manner is also perfectly coherent. Condemned to death precisely because of his relationship with the goddess, he is loved and bewailed by her, and his death is a source of sorrow and desolation for the entire country, until his pathos is in some way redeemed, and the goddess pacified. In contrast to the Demetrian myth, which knows the alternating situation of Persephone, the case of Attis knows neither a periodic return nor a form of revival of the character. He dies once and for all, as emerges from all the testimonies, with only a very few exceptions. Nevertheless, dead Attis is annually commemorated by the funeral rites of lamentation performed by the Phrygians before his image. In this manner, the character is felt to be present in a ritually effective way, and order returns after its disruption. The establishment of the rite in which the moment of mourning is essential and characteristic insofar as it is a commemoration of the pathos of Attis together with the Divine Mother, thus appears as the conclusive moment of the whole episode, the one which, repeated annually, guarantees in a stable and definite manner the regular rhythm of the seasonal cycle. Amongst the many literary sources which attest the connections of Attis with the pine tree and the functions of the rite in the ritual of Cybele, we have Ovid who, in accordance with the general theme of his Metamorphoses, actually talks of the transformation of the Cybeleus Attis into the trunk of a pine tree. In actual fact, this tree is really an image of Attis, the sign of his presence in the practice of the rite, as is confirmed in a passage from the Thebaeus, evoking the behavior of the Gallus of Cybele who, at the height of his religious enthusiasm, shakes on his chest the sacred branches of the pine. The commentator glosses this expression, underlining the holiness of the tree venerated in the ceremonies of the Mother of the Gods, under which lay Attis beloved by the goddess. Certain Christian authors, appealing to the interpretations of the same learned pagans, try to prove that the naturalistic references in the myths and religious traditions of paganism are essential. Eusebius, for example, claims that Attis and Adonis display profound analogies with the fruits of the earth in their character and in their vicissitude. But, he adds, Attis is more the symbol of the flowers that bud in the spring and are picked before they reach their bloom. His mutilation is the sign of the fate of the flower which must fall in order for the fruit to ripen. Adonis, on the other hand, is the symbol of the harvest of ripe fruits. Attis and Adonis would consequently be connected with the two successive moments of the flowering and the ripening of the fruit. Even if we do not accept an interpretation which simply reduces the two deities to the naturalistic element, there is no doubt that, in the definition suggested by Eusebius, we have an item of evidence specifically connecting Attis with fluorescent vegetation. The same connection between Attis and spring flowers, also present in the Phrygian version of the myth, is stressed by Augustine, who appeals to the authority of Porphyry and elaborates a complex speculation around the equation of Attis with flowers, concluding that the significance of the character's mutilation must be seen in the fact that flos decidit ante fructum. A close parallelism between the vicissitude of Attis and the annual cycle of vegetation is also detected by Firmicus Maternus, who tries to prove that the Phrygian myth and rite arose on the one hand as a result of the divinization of human beings in antiquity, and on the other reflect natural experiences connected with the agricultural rhythm. He thus appeals both to the canons of euhemerism and to the widespread tendency in cultivated pagan circles of the time to interpret the characters of the myth as personifications or symbols of natural phenomena or events. After pointing out that of all the cosmic elements the Phrygians of Pessinus display a particular veneration for the earth which they call Mother of all things, Firmicus says that, in order to have sacred rites with an annual recurrence, they instituted ceremonies of lamentation in honor of a queen who had caused the death of her young lover by her jealousy. At the conclusion of what is obviously a euhemeristic interpretation of the Phrygian version of the myth,
the Christian polemicist says that the Phrygians ut satis iratae mulieri facerent aut ut paenitentis alacium quaerent, quem Paulo ante sepelierent, revixisi actarunt, et cum mulieris animus ex impatientia, nimi amoris arderit, mortua adolescenti templa fecerunt.
There follows a parallelism between the lot of Attis and that of the crops. The relationship between the goddess and the young man is seen in the light of the relationship existing between the crops and the earth.
The mutilation of Attis is thus equivalent to harvesting mortem ipsius dicunt, quod semina collecta conundant, vitam rursus, quod iacta semina annuis vicibus reduntur.
It is precisely the parallelism which the polemicist establishes between the youthful protagonist of the Phrygian myth and the fate of the Phryg, not found elsewhere, since Attis is invariably associated with arborescent and florescent vegetation, which has induced the Christian author to talk of Attis's rebirth as well as of his death. The verb revivere, moreover, appears to have been borrowed by Firmicus from Christian terminology. Consequently, the notion of a resurrection of Attis does not belong to the Phrygian mythical ritual context. Despite the use of the verb in question, the resort to the concept of resurrection really does not seem suitable for defining Attis's vicissitude, even in the form in which it is presented by Firmicus Maternus. The idea of resurrection implies a definitive victory over death through the reconstitution of the psycho-physical integrity of the individual resurrected. The association between the vicissitude of the young Phrygian shepherd and the crops shows rather that in this perspective the lot of Attis is stabilized in an alternating rhythm of presence and absence, and does not include a definitive and total liberation from death. On the other hand, it would be going too far to say that Firmicus Maternus's account is nothing but the fruit of a personal interpretation by the author or of late speculations in a physical key on pagan myths, and that we should consequently reject the idea of a parallelism between the vicissitude of Attis and vegetation. For the chthonic and vegetal connections of the character appear evident from the documents examined, even if, as we have seen, they concern arborescent and fluorescent vegetation and not crops. The very iconography of the character recalls this relationship with vegetal fertility when he is represented in the act of supporting a cornucopia or a basketful of fruit. Amongst the various examples of this type there is a statue found in Athens close of the Stoa of the Attalids and ascribable to the 1st to 2nd century AD, displaying a significant correspondence with the mythical and ritual data examined earlier. It represents Attis with a basket in which, in addition to pine cones and pomegranates, we can distinguish a bunch of violets. We must now see whether, aside from the mythical evidence which makes of the death of Attis the conclusive moment of the vicissitude, only redeemed, according to the Phrygian version, by a form of survival in death and physical incorruptibility, we can find further indications of Attis's connection with the cyclical rhythm of vegetation, as it is expressed in the late testimony of Firmicus Maternus. We should therefore examine a series of sources concerning the cult which associate Attis, in Greece and Rome, with the Great Mother, both in public forms and in those reserved for private or obviously esoteric communities, in a context of genuine mysteries. The public aspects of the cult of Attis provide elements useful for the religious historical characterization of the personage and serve to elucidate the circumstances by which, in some circles and at certain periods of history, Attis, together with the Great Mother, came to be the center of a mystery structure, the mystic cult of Cybele and Attis in the Greek world. The earliest attestation of Attis as the object of a cult together with the Great Mother on Greek soil is provided, as we know, by the documents referring to the community of the Rogamapes Epsilon of the Metroon at the Piraeus. The inscriptions, consisting for the most part in honorific decrees for the priestesses who presided over the cult, fall into the period which runs from the middle of the 3rd to the beginning of the 1st century BC, but numerous ex-votos also belong to the Roman imperial period. Nevertheless, the earliest document which reveals the cult of the Mother of the Gods at the Piraeus is a decree of Theosotai, a community of foreigners who were then to yield their own rights to the sanctuary to the citizens of Athens, thereby joining the religious association of the Orginas. The cult practiced by this association, at all events, displays indubious Phrygian connotations, evident from the presence of a ritual in honor of Attis. The priestess Critea is praised for the piety with which she has tended the cult dedicated to the goddesses, and for the preparation of the bed Epsilon Mufitau Epsilon Roalfatau. The inscription was made in the month of, and it is probable that the festival commemorated had been celebrated in the not-too-distant past. This, then, would be a springtime characterization of the Attidaea. The significance and precise nature of the Attidaea, however, remain largely problematical. Foucault's hypothesis that it was a mystery ritual with 2 ceremonies, one of which commemorated the death of the personage and the other his return to life, is open to various objections. It should above all be kept in mind that our documentation does not confirm the hypothesis that Attis is at the center of a mythical ritual scheme entailing death followed by a resurrection, as the stable and definitive recuperation of life. There is rather a survival of Attis in death, in relation to the sphere of vegetal fertility, just as there is a religiously defined presence in the cult, characterized in its earliest forms chiefly by funeral dirges. Lagrange and other authors before him have thought that the mention of the Kapalam Danueta is an allusion to the rite of the lectisternium, which was recurrent in the normal Greek cult. Finally, the reference to 2 ceremonies in honor of Attis has been understood as concerning a double celebration of the festival, one by the members of the community, who were Athenian citizens, and one by foreigners, but none of these solutions are sufficiently well-grounded to be accepted without reserve. To conclude, while it is not possible to say anything definite about an ultimately mystery nature of the rites in question, there remains the significant evidence of a private association which, in the 3rd century BC, knew and venerated beside her young Paredros, thereby showing a familiarity with the Phrygian forms of the myth and the cult of Cybele. This is further emphasized by a dedication to Artemis Nana, in the Museum of Athens, originating from the Piraeus. It is more than likely that it comes from the Metroon of the Orgines, thus revealing the complexity of the mythical picture familiar to them. If is the gray-sized form of the name of an Elamite and Babylonian divinity, usually identified with the Persian Anahita assimilated in her turn by Artemis, we must remember that, in the mythical version recounted by Arnobius, Nana is the name of the nymph or the youthful mother of Attis. Nor must we forget that it was also at the Piraeus that the above-mentioned relief with a dedication to Attis and Agdistis was discovered which, even if it does not appear to come from the Metroon, points to a circle venerating Cybele with decidedly Oriental and Phrygian features. The existence of the mythical and ritual complex in its pessinuntic form as transpires from the presence of Nana and Agdistis may perhaps indicate a new solution, different from that proposed hitherto, to the problem of the enigmatic plural the goddesses which recurs in 2 decrees of the Orginas. Was the community of the Piraeus perhaps aware of the 2 aspects which coexisted in the character whom the commonest Hellenizing tradition presented as the Great Mother of the Gods? Did it distinguish, as in Arnobius's version, between two deities, both connected with Attis in an essentially unitary perspective? In either case, a certain duplicity of the divine figure of the mother seems to be reflected in the use, attested in certain examples of Attic neskoi, of a double representation of the goddess. According to a typology in which other religious contexts also participated, besides the Attidaea, the Origines of the Piraeus were acquainted with another ceremony which consisted in preparing two thrones as beautiful as possible. This entailed a general assembly of the community, and was probably dedicated to the mother of the gods and to Attis, in whose honor the thrones in question were prepared. Not even in this case, however, can we say anything precise about the nature of the rite or an ultimately mystery character. An indication of the particular quality of Attis and of the mythical ritual complex in which he belongs is provided by a statement by Neanthes of Cyzicus, who claims that the mythical account concerning the figure is mystic, in other words that it is part of a religious context which must be surrounded with the utmost secrecy. This also emerges from the reservations advanced by Pausanias many centuries later at the very moment at which he is about to recount the mythical traditions relating to Attis. His nature constitutes a religious secret, even if various stories have been told about him. In the account of the elegiac poet Hermesianax, the orgia celebrated by Attis in honor of the mother of the gods do not seem to have a mystery character, but should be identified rather with the enthusiastic orgiastic rites typical of the earliest forms of the cult of Cybele. Nevertheless, we cannot deny the presence of a mystery connotation in the cult described by Nicander. In the Alexipharmacon, the author evokes the caves of Rhea Labrine and the hall for the orgia of Attis. The scholiast explains the term by saying that it applies to sacred subterranean areas dedicated to Rhea, where the viers of those who celebrate the cult of Cybele and Attis are deposited. The thalami mentioned by Nicander would then be places consecrated for the cultic practice of the Galli, which certainly cannot be identified with the entire complex of the Cybele's ritual, or with the form of the mysteries which it sometimes assumes. In other words, nothing permits us to identify the mysteries of Cybele with the mutilation of the Galli, which is only one aspect of the general picture of the cult of the Phrygian great goddess. The commentator does not offer any explanation of the term used by Nicander. It is difficult to decide whether the sacred rite celebrated in this hall for the dedicated to Attis can be identified with the practice of the Galli or whether it is a mystery cult in the true sense, with the initiation of the believers in esotericism. In reporting the essential characteristics of the myth which provides the basis for the cultic connection between Cybele and Attis, the scholiast offers a further element which can contribute to the religious historical appreciation of the character and his rite. The mythical tradition to which he appeals can be traced back to the Lydian version, in which Attis is a shepherd, deeply devoted to Cybele who loves him in return. He dies because of the jealousy of Zeus who sets a boar onto him. At the end of the episode, the commentator of Nicander says that the goddess buried him lamenting and the Phrygians bewail him in the spring. We have here the theme of the familiarity between the goddess and the young Paredros. The familiarity, however, is the cause of Attis's ruin, in accordance with the typically ambivalent relationship between the great goddess and her companion in the context of cults aimed at promoting fertility, like the Babylonian cult of Ishtar and Tammuz. A phenomenological analogy and perhaps also an historical contiguity with such a context emerges not only from the doleful and collective character of the cult, but also from its periodic recurrence. Attis is the object of annual rites of lamentation which, inaugurated by the goddess herself, are celebrated by the entire population at the arrival of the spring. The spring element of the rites confirms what we observed earlier about Attis's vegetal connections and, more precisely, about Attis's relationship with fluorescent vegetation. Again, in connection with Nicander's work, we have a testimony which illustrates the content of the rite performed in honor of Cybele and the young Phrygian shepherd. In the metaphrases to the Alexipharmacon, Eutychnius Sophist says that the sacred rites of Rhea persist amongst them, the marriage of Attis and all that follows, which is ritually performed by them. These words give us a fairly clear image of a ritual which evokes cultically the moments of a divine vicissitude, although we have no reason to suspect an initiatory esoteric character in the participation in this rite. The quality of liturgical drama which characterizes it expresses one of the aspects typical of the mystery, insofar as it is a cult connected with a divine vicissitude ritually repeated in its most significant moments. As for the content of this liturgical representation, the mention of the gamos does not refer to a hypothetical marriage between Attis and Cybele, about which, if we accept a decidedly euhemeristic source, our documentation says nothing, but to the episode of the attempted marriage between the youth and a woman or nymph who, in the Phrygian version of the myth, is responsible for the crisis in his relationship with the great goddess and thus for Attis's death. This episode is widely emphasized in the sources, from Ovid to Apuleius and Julian. The latter attributes a great importance to the union of Attis with the nymph in the context of his Sophic and Platonizing interpretation of the myth. The inscription which appears on a statuette of Attis seated, with pastoral attributes, also seems to allude to this marriage. According to the interpretation suggested by C.H. Picard, A bronze bowl from Alexandria provides a figurative representation of this dramatic episode in the story of Attis, while P. Friedlander interprets the complex scene undoubtedly connected with Cybele's cult on a tapestry at the Metropolitan Museum of New York along the same lines. From these data it emerges clearly that the gamos of Attis ritually evoked by the Phrygians is no less than the tragic event which constitutes the climax of the whole vicissitude. The cause of the character's death, it is also the cause of his final return to the Divine Mother, and indeed, as a result of that event the relationship between the two characters receives a precise ritual sanction, which both guarantees the lot of Attis as the object of the cult and consecrates his presence, no longer endangered, next to the Great Mother, to the mystic cult of Cybele and Attis in the Roman Empire. The funereal and doleful nature of the Cybele's rites commemorating the vicissitude of Attis also emerges from certain testimonies of Latin authors who confirm the public context of the manifestations of grief by the devotees of Cybele. Thus in Seneca's Agamemnon we read of the Tristis turba who, striking their breasts and lacerating their arms, bewail the Phrygian Attis, and Statius mentions the women of Phrygia who non sua funera plorant. Suetonius recalls the day on which the venerators of the Mother of the Gods begin to lament and weep, while Arrian says that the Romans worship the Phrygian Rhea who came to them from Piscinus, and then adds that the bewailing of Attis according to the Phrygian custom is also practiced in Rome. This penthos ends by bathing the image of the goddess in the waters of the Almo, in other words with the rite of the lavatio, known to us from numerous sources. This rite constitutes in the Roman ceremonial the re-evocation of the ritual bath to which the idol of Cybele was submitted when it arrived in the city. Even Martial and Valerius Flaccus allude to the lavatio as the conclusive moment of the Phrygian ritual, characterized by a funereal aspect. Nevertheless, the text of the Argonautica introduces a new element with the mention of the joy of Cybele and of the Festi Taetae, with an obvious allusion to the manifestations of joy coming immediately after the grief. We may then wonder, what is the significance of this earliest statement of an explosion of joy amongst the participants in the rite of Cybele after the funeral celebrations? It is only in the 3rd and 4th century that we have various testimonies concerning a ceremony of a joyous nature, the Hilaria, which, celebrated after the Lamentations, is in its turn followed by the Lavatio, which puts an end to the cycle of the March festivals in honor of the Mother of the Gods in Attis. The theory of Carcopino, who attributes to the Emperor Claudius the institution of the entire series of Cybele's ceremonies, including the Hilaria, as it is attested by the so-called Philocelian calendar of 354 AD, is opposed by Lambrix. The latter shows that, before the middle of the 3rd century, we have no certain attestations of a rite of joy in the March festival, since the Lavatio follows immediately after the manifestations of mourning, and concludes the annual ceremonies in honor of Cybele and Attis. He therefore distinguishes between two successive reforms in the Roman cult of the Mother of the Gods, the first of which, ascribable to Claudius, entailed the admission of the Phrygian ritual in its typically mournful form, with flagellations and orgiastic manifestations, sometimes culminating in the practice of castration. In this first phase, then, we have the ceremony of the Dendrophoria and the Dies Sanguinis, which is followed by the Lavatio at the end of the festival cycle. Only later, perhaps owing to Antoninus Pius, whose interest in the cult of Cybele is well known, and anyhow in the period which runs from the reign of Hadrian to that of Alexander Severus, was there a second, more extensive reform, with the introduction of the rite of the Hilaria. Even if the reconstruction proposed by Lambrix seems quite probable, we cannot neglect the fact that, in the text of the Argonautica, we read of manifestations of joy, albeit after the Lavatio. This would suggest that in a fairly remote period, and anyhow as far back as the 1st century AC, expressions of joy were also part of the Roman cult of Cybele. Only later, however, perhaps in the Antonine period as Lambrix suggests, were they institutionalized in a ceremony performed on a particular day, between the moment of mourning and the conclusive one of the sacred bath. Such manifestations of joy and the later festival of the Hilaria do not of course express the idea of a resurrection of Attis, of which there is no trace in contemporary sources but rather the certainty of his survival, either in the form of physical incorruptibility or in that, religiously defined, of his constant presence in the cult beside the Great Mother. Moreover, the mythical image of the body of Attis saved from dissolution and able to grow and to move, albeit only in certain features, expresses the idea that his disappearance is neither total nor final. It is in this sense that we must interpret the statement in Plutarch, that the Phrygians, believing that the god goes to sleep in the winter and awakes in the summer, sing hymns of lamentation in the winter and in the summer sing to wake him, in the manner of the Bacchantes. We are not told in honor of which theos the Phrygians perform a double ritual, both mournful and joyful. It is likely that it is a god connected with the seasonal change, of the type of Attis. This god, at all events, is situated in an alternating rhythm, entailing sleep and reawakening, in a pattern of presence and absence which, in this context, is parallel to the concealment of vegetation in the winter and its reappearance in the summer. This would therefore confirm the existence in the Phrygian religious world of an ideology akin to the one expressed in the so-called fertility cults. The sleep and reawakening of the god of vegetation are ritually encouraged by the song, First Sad Then Gay, accompanied by manifestations of religious enthusiasm. Thus the rite itself guarantees, with the falling asleep and the reawakening of the god, the regular alternation of the seasons. Even if we cannot claim that the theos of Plutarch is Attis, this testimony demonstrates the typically Phrygian characteristics of an annual cult, with lamentations followed by manifestations of joy as the expression of the certainty that the god has reawakened. In the light of this information, the Cybele's ritual, as it is described by Valerius Flaccus, acquires a precise meaning. The joy of the mother and the Festae Tidae, which follow the funeral dirges, do not reveal the resurrection of Attis, but the awareness of his presence, beyond the doleful moment of death. Manifestations of joy, moreover, appear in the kindred rituals of Adonis and Osiris, where the doleful aspect also prevails, in connection with the departure of or the agonizing quest for the god. But, as in the case of Adonis, the sadness of the farewell is accompanied by joy, in the certainty of his future ritual return, so the Inventio Osiridis produces outbursts of joy among the worshippers. Nor should we forget that a typical alternation of anguish and joy characterizes the ritual practice of Eleusis when it commemorates the abduction of Kore and her return to her mother. The later sources which talk of the Hilaria do not help us to solve the problem of the prospects offered to the adepts participating in such a festival. Nor do we get any further with the physical interpretation of the myth and the rite of Cybele suggested by Macrobius, who establishes a parallelism between Attis and the sun, and sees the grief and joy which accompany the ritual of the Phrygian god as a symbol of the alternating phases of the heavenly body. We cannot either apply to the religious reality of the cult of Cybele the Neoplatonic interpretation of Julian, who detects in the myth of Attis the great theme of the relationship between the intelligible world and the sensible world, mediated by the demiurge, who descends to the lower level of genesis and mutability, but soon escapes from it to return to the sphere of the eternal and immutable. He therefore sees in the joy of the Hilaria the happiness of the soul escaped from limitlessness, generation and inner agitation to return to the gods. Sallustius's analysis follows the same lines as that of Julian, and obviously depends on the oration to the Mother of the Gods. Nevertheless, he goes deeper into the parallelism between the vicissitude of the soul and the ritual practice, showing in each phase of the spring festivals in honor of Attis a precise correspondence with the decisive moments of that vicissitude. While the cutting of the tree and fasting symbolize being cut off from the further progress of Genesis, he tells that, after this we are fed on milk, as though being here is the verbatim transcription. Reborn, that is followed by rejoicings and garlands and as it were a new ascent to the gods 148. The process of the transposition of the ritual elements onto a philosophical level of so obviously Neoplatonic an imprint comes to the fore in Sallustius' disquisitions, where it is stressed, even stylistically, by the continuous resort to the comparative adverb. This does not entitle us to conclude that the cult of Cybele entailed, in the common consciousness of the worshippers, the idea of a rebirth and a divinization of man, based on the vicissitude of the god, for otherwise we would have to admit that the cult included the idea of the divine origin of the soul and its descent into the world of Genesis seen as a fall, an idea which also appears in the texts of Sallust and Julian, thus constituting the premise of all their arguments. If Julian and Sallustius give us the image of an Attis Platonicus in the context of a mysterio-sophic elaboration of the Phrygian myth and cult as might have been in fashion in the cultivated pagan circles of which the two authors are such eminent representatives, they still cannot be taken as witnesses of the significance which that myth and that cult assumed in the mind of the average worshipper. We are now left with the late testimony of Damascus, who records a dream, the protagonist of which he believes to be Attis, in whose honor the mother of the gods celebrates the Hilaria. This is regarded as a salvation from Hades which has already been obtained, which is already known. The manifestations of joy of which Attis is the object appear as the sign of a which concerns both the young Paredros of Cybele and man. It is a guarantee against death which, as far as Attis is concerned, is undoubtedly intrinsic to the mythical ritual structure of which he is the protagonist. Survival in death, ritually celebrated at the annual festivals by the mother, is the element which characterizes the deity in question. In Damascus's text, man receives that form of salvation from Hades enjoyed by Attis. We must not overestimate this testimony in view of the late period from which it comes. Yet it would be wrong to deny it any value. It is, after all, the only explicit attestation of a soteriological prospect in an eschatological sense in the cult of Cybele, at least concerning the spring festivals celebrating the vicissitude of Attis, 150. So we might assume that, as from a certain period, the participation in the March festival, with its typical alternation of manifestations of grief and joy, established an immediate relationship of familiarity with the gods, and offered the worshipper the promise of a benevolent protection by the Great Mother, a guarantee of eschatological prospects based on the model of Attis, the object of the goddess's benevolence and rescued by her from the definitive disappearance of death. In conclusion, the features peculiar to the character of Attis and his cult allow us to define as mystic the mythical ritual complex concerning him. insofar as it is a cult which celebrates a divine vicissitude characterized by a profound pathos, in which the adept participates ritually, establishing a more intense and immediate relationship with the deity. In it there occurs that interaction between the divine, cosmic and human levels in which the destiny of the god and the destiny of man are not identical but enter into a live and deeply felt sympathia. Religious historical comparisons may lead to the discovery of specific analogies and differences between this mythical ritual complex and other Greek and Near Eastern cults, which also include a divine couple connected in various ways with the sphere of animal and vegetal fertility and involved in a similar vicissitude. 151. It would then be possible to identify and circumscribe a typological category, flexible but substantially homogeneous, of mystic cults in the sense of the term here suggested, next to that of the mystery cults, which both contain a divine vicissitude and are characterized by initiatory and esoteric structures. For the time being, suffice it to observe that the themes common to such mystic cults, even though characterized in different ways in the various cultural contexts, can be found in the chthonic and vegetal connections of the two deities and in the typical ambivalence of their mutual relationship, according to which the goddess exceeds in power and stability the male Paredros, who is in turn marked by a doleful destiny as a result of his bond with the goddess. 152. To this we can add the annual recurrence of the rite commemorating the episode and the public context in which the cult is celebrated. Chapter 4. The problem of the Phrygian mysteries. We have seen that in the Hellenistic period the Phrygian goddess appears as the object of a cult characterized also by esotericism and initiation, in other words with a typically mystery connotation. In this cult, however, the figure of Attis does not intervene. In the Roman imperial period too there are cases in which the mysteries of the mother of the gods are mentioned, but in which the goddess's Phrygian Paredros seems to be absent. If this absence cannot be attributed to the reticence or the inadequacy of the sources, we would have a double line of development in the Cybele's religion. It starts on the one hand from the Hellenized cult of Cybele, already naturalized in Greece by the end of the Archaic era as the figure of the meter theon. This cult, with enthusiastic orgiastic aspects, undergoes an evolution in the Hellenistic period in a mystery sense which, as far as can be deduced from the relevant sources, would seem to be a purely Greek phenomenon. It is probably part of that process through which, side by side with the persistence of the ancient mysteries of Eleusis and Samothrace, the Hellenistic period sees the flourishing, or anyhow the return to favor, of other cult centers of Demeter and the Kabiri, which present an initiatory esoteric structure, one at the same time as the Dionysiac cult moves ever more frequently from its earlier form of the Thiasoi to that of the mystery communities. 2. As far as the cult of Cybele is concerned, the adoption of the mystery form can be interpreted in the context of the tradition which associates or actually assimilates the mother of the gods with Demeter, as the result of a specific influence of the Eleusinian model. The presence of the figure of Attis beside the Great Mother is attested in Greece at least as early as the 4th century BC, in the forms which have already been analyzed. While the mystery nature of the cult practiced by the Orgenes of the Piraeus and that known to Nicander remains largely conjectural, we know of Phrygian mysteries which concern the divine couple formed by Cybele and Attis in the Roman imperial period both in the East and in the West. These mysteries coexist, albeit with a frequency and a dissemination which have yet to be specified, with public forms of cult which, in the case of the great March festivals celebrated in Rome and other parts of the empire, reveal the persistence of those features typical of fertility cults. So marked are these features that they can actually be said to define the religious historical consistency of the Phrygian mythical ritual complex. A basic problem, then, is to establish the sort of relationship that existed between these two forms of cult, esoteric initiatory on the one hand and public on the other, and to see whether they can both be traced back to that Oriental Phrygian and, more broadly speaking, micro-Asiatic world from which the deities in question originated. In other words, we ought to know whether those esoteric initiatory forms which it sometimes knows in the West, beside its public and official aspects, were already present in the Oriental homeland of the cult of Cybele before it was introduced into Greece and the Hellenized world and into Rome. To begin with, it must be admitted that no solution to this problem can be provided by an interpretation like that of Ramsay, who asserts the existence of ancient mysteries in Asia Minor on the basis of a heterogeneous body of evidence concerning disparate phenomena and situations, without any historical links the one with the other. According to Ramsay III, these mysteries guaranteed the continuity of the local Anatolian religion, centered on the figure of a great goddess, quite independently from the religious influence of the Phrygian conquerors entailing the prevalence of a male god. An example of such a religious situation is provided by Antioch of Pisidia, the site of two sanctuaries dedicated to men. One of these, going back to the 3rd century BC, came to light yielding a vast quantity of epigraphic and monumental material. While the inscriptions only mention the godmen, a small building within the shrine seems to have been dedicated to a goddess, judging from the presence of numerous statuettes representing a female figure of the type of Cybele or Artemis. This deity would thus have occupied a position inferior to the god whose sanctuary it was. Ramsay maintains, however, that a building located near the shrine was a sort of telesterion in which were celebrated mystic rites pertaining not to men but to the great goddess. We would therefore be dealing with the old Phrygian or Anatolian ritual of a goddess and not the novel ritual of a god. The archaeological material from the sanctuary at Antioch, however, is not sufficient to justify the hypothesis of such a mystery ritual, reconstructed by Ramsay with appeals to various literary and epigraphic sources of different periods and circles, even if broadly connected with Anatolian contexts. He appeals successively to the report of Demosthenes on the mysteries of Sabazius practiced in Athens in the 4th century BC, to the Symbolon of the mysteries of Cybele reported by Clement of Alexandria, and to certain formulas on the golden laminae relating to the Greek world, whether Orphic or Eleusinian. The rite expressed by the verb finally is interpreted as the second initiatory grade, on the basis of a few inscriptions of the Roman imperial period concerning the mysteries celebrated in the sanctuary of Apollo at Claros. If we come to documents more certainly connected with a Cybele's milieu, we see that the earliest mention of mysteries of the great goddess in her Anatolian homeland is to be found in the inscription of Sardis I mentioned earlier and published by Robert. It is not possible to be absolutely sure whether the decree was issued in Greek or Aramaic. In the latter case, our document would be a translation, albeit contemporary with the original and consequently ascribable to the 4th century BC. The text in our possession speaks of Muepsilon Sigmatar Hoyatalpha of Sabazius, of Agdistis, and of Ma's cults which the priests of Zeus, whom we can probably recognize as the Iranian Ahura Mazda, are forbidden to attend. The existence of rites with an initiatory and esoteric character pertaining to Sabazius in the 4th century BC is attested in Athens by the famous passage of the De Corona, where the ritual cry of the Thyasotai is mentioned, which evokes the person of Attis. Without indulging in a gratuitous confusion between the context of Cybele and that of Sabazius, we should nevertheless keep in mind the frequent and varied connections between them. These are demonstrated by Strabo, who emphasizes Sabazius's pertaining to the Phrygian cycle gravitating round the meter, and who would seem to make of him the son of the goddess. At the same time, the goddess Ma of Cappadocia also has various links with the Phrygian Great Mother, and the spread of her cult in the West is always close to that of Cybele, whose dea pedisequa she appears to be. The inscription of Sardis consequently reflects a real religious situation, referring to local cults which fit into a fairly homogeneous context. To define them as mysteries, however, raises further questions rather than offering possible solutions to our problem, since it is impossible to establish the religious reality which covers such a denomination. Indeed, while for Ma of Cappadocia this is the only report attesting to the mystery nature of her cult, we cannot tell whether the Muepsilon Sigmatar Hoyatalpha of Sabazius and Agdistis are religious complexes of an esoteric initiatory type, or whether the Persian governor used the term to stress the essential difference between the Mazdaic cult of Zeus and the mystic rites of the Anatolian deities, in which excitement and religious enthusiasm are a decisive feature. While the denomination of Rogameotalpha or persists, the habit of calling the rites of Cybele mysteries becomes quite frequent in the late Hellenistic era and the Roman imperial period, even though in most cases it is hard to appreciate exactly what this means. It remains uncertain whether the source is referring to the public cult of Cybele, characterized by those enthusiastic and orgiastic manifestations in which the mystic quality of the cult itself is expressed, or whether it indicates more specifically an esoteric form of the cult. The verses of the Alexipharmacon in which Nicander showed the Kernephoros priestess minister of Rhea, rushing into the street and uttering the terrible cry of the Aedaia, give the scholiast the chance to stress the mystery aspects of the cult of the Phrygian goddess to whom the Hellenistic author was referring. The epithet of Kappi Epsilon Ranu Omicron Firhumicron given to the character is explained by saying that she is the priestess who bears the vases, the Kapparhonu Alpha being special receptacles used in the mystery rites in which lamps are placed. The scholiast then defines the rites of Cybele as Muepsilon Sigmatar Hoyota Alpha. In his treatise On the Rivers, the pseudo-Plutarch also talks on several occasions about the mysteries of the Phrygian goddess, without it being possible to decide on the precise meaning of this terminology. In an initial passage, on the authority of Agatharchides, the author of Firhupsilonga Myotalpha Kappa, he says that whoever sees the stone while the mysteries of the goddess are being performed soon goes mad. The stone in question is to be found on the sacred mountain Beresyntheon, which thus turns out to be the setting where the of the Great Mother are performed. This brings us back to that mountain context which so often characterizes the mystic orgiastic ritual of the Phrygian goddess. It is to this too that the episode of Scamandros, son of Corybas and Demades, refers. Having suddenly seen the goddess while her were being celebrated, he was filled with folly and cast himself into the Xanthus, which then changed its name to Scamandros. It is more difficult to reach a conclusion about the specific consistency of the mysteries of the Mother of the Gods towards which Sagaris displayed such indifference and contempt as to merit the terrible punishment of the goddess, again in the form of which induced him to take his life by plunging into the waters of the Zerobades. Nevertheless, the mention of the galley whom the character insulted leads one to think that the Mypsilon Sigmatar Hoyotalpha of the mother here evoked are the public rites characterized by the typical expressing the beneficent possession by the goddess of her devotees, which turns into destructive madness for the impious. Finally, there is a reference to mysteries in the Pseudo-Plutarch's brief tract, and this is of a more general nature. Alone amongst the passages of the same work examined hitherto, it alludes to a context of seclusion in which the ritual is performed. After describing the vicissitudes of the Kernophoros of Ida who, having generated the Idaean dactyls from Agestos, was ravished by folly in the Aditon of Rhea, the author says that on the mountain which was
to take its name from her there could be found the stone Kryphios Chus, monoistos mysteries and then fenete.
This text does not mention the gods in whose honor they are celebrated during which the hidden stone appears. The general meaning of the account, moreover, and the circumstance that the altars of Zeus and of the should be built on the mountain, justifies the conclusion that the rites here mentioned concern the Phrygian, Great Mother. Their definition as mysteries is not sufficient to suppose that they had a specifically initiatory esoteric character. Nevertheless, such a definition, as in the cases discussed above, shows that for the anonymous author of this mythological and erudite composition, the orgiastic rites of Cybele fitted into the picture of those cults which Strabo, in his famous theological excursus of the 10th book, places among the epsilon rumicron pigam alpha Mypsilon sigma tau iota kappa. In some cases, then, the authors term mysteries that particular form of cult constituted by the gruesome rite of the galley, implying a very individual type of initiation which should be distinguished from an initiation open to all the worshippers. Sometimes, moreover, this denomination seems to be used in a more specific and technical sense, when we find an esoteric initiatory aspect of the cult together with the adoption of the sacral qualification of mystis as a result of participation. The most significant documents include certain inscriptions from Finis, ascribable to the 1st century AD, which mention an association of initiates of the Mother of the Gods, whose members take the name of. This epithet has been interpreted as referring in its first component to Attis, who would consequently have played an important part in the mysteries of the goddess. A myst of the Mother Basileia is recorded at Pergamum, and at Sardis an inscription of 200 AD talks of a Mubupsilon sigma tuor or hoyotomacronu to taupsiloniota, which can probably be identified as a hall for celebrating the mystery rites which had the young Paredros of Cybele as their protagonist. A rock sanctuary formed by various natural caves near Juvaja housed A of the meter or Rhea, whom we can probably see as the Anatolian great goddess. It prepared and probably a place suitable for the mystery cult inside the caves already used as a sanctuary of the goddess, in honor of the mother invoked with the attribute of. The thyasis had a hierarchical structure, presided over as it was by A, and an esoteric initiatory structure. Judging from the mention of An, the latter makes the dedication to the Mountain Mother for the salvation of himself and the community over which he presides. A difficult problem is posed by the identification of the to whom is dedicated A in Smyrna. We may well wonder whether she should be identified with the Mother of the Gods, the protective deity of the city from which she derives the epithet of Smyrnike, while from the nearby Mount Sipylus, she gets the more frequent epithet of Sipylene. And indeed, in the same city we have an attestation of a sigmanu taunu mupsilon tau tau, nevertheless the attribute of which defines the Demeter Thesmophoros whose temple stood outside the city walls, shows that the Greek goddess assumed some aspects peculiar to Cybele, according moreover, to a well-documented tradition. It is therefore quite likely that the community of the initiates of Smyrna venerated a deity who on the one hand maintained the characteristics of the local great goddess but on the other had received the prerogatives of Demeter Thesmophoros as a result of the general process of Hellenization of the local cults, which had reached its maturity by the 2nd century AD. The presence of mysteries in the cult of this great goddess, furthermore, seems to confirm that influence of the Demetrian model which seems more than likely in the formation of esoteric initiatory institutions in the cult of Cybele. At all events, aside from the problem of the identity of the anonymous of the Synod of the Mystae mentioned earlier and the problem concerning the relationship of the Mother of the Gods with the Demeter Thesmophoros, venerated in mystery forms at Smyrna, a special, mystic connotation of the cult of Cybele in this city would seem to emerge from a frequently reproduced dedicatory epigram. It is a Greek inscription which accompanied the statue of a certain Hermodorus, who dedicated his own image to his lady Eucharistion and imposed a fine on anyone removing it.
Fine must be paid to meter than Smyrnike teleto. The obscure term teleto has been interpreted by Peake as a genitive plural of teleti, meaning teleten gyneka.
The fine was thus intended to contribute to the expenses entailed by the organization of the ritual celebrations in honor of the goddess. Their definition as tau epsilon lam depsilon to alpha might then represent a festival context with mystery aspects. We are probably not entitled, however, to attribute to the Great Mother's followers an inscription of Chaim which mentions mystae and mysteries. Indeed, despite the appearance of A, the religious community to which it refers seems to be placed under the patronage of a male deity, not otherwise known. Finally, the relationship with the cult of Cybele of Cyzicus, recorded in some inscriptions which also mention is highly conjectural. All the reports quoted hitherto refer to localities in Asia Minor where, ever since the beginning of the imperial period, the cult of Cybele takes the form of mysteries. We know nothing, however, about their ritual and ideological content. As far as Greece is concerned, we have an interesting report by Pausanias who describes the principal monuments of Corinth and recalls a bronze statue of Hermes, represented seated with a ram next to him. He adds, "The story told in the Of the Mother about Hermes and the ram is one that I know but which I shall not repeat." Pausanias's reservations about the lambda gamma omicron referring to Hermes reveals clearly that the Talit of the Mother to which he refers is a cult of a mystery type. The presence of Hermes next to the goddess can be documented, as we know, in numerous figurative monuments which show the character, often accompanied by a torch-bearing girl, in the function of propelos of the Great Mother. In these cases he seems to substitute the Phrygian Peredros, emphasizing the Hellenization of the Oriental deity who had become, in Greece, the solemn meter theon. Nevertheless, there is no lack of monuments of the Roman imperial period representing Hermes together with Attis next to Cybele. In any case, Pausanias's report attributes to Hermes a role in the mystic rites of the meter about whose specific nature we can say nothing. There is also, of course, the testimony of Julian, who confirms the presence of Hermes in the mysteries of Attis and records the title by which the initiates address the god who claims to light the torches for the wise Attis. In the Latin West, the titles of Sacrati and Consecrani reveal the presence of initiates in some centers of the cult of Cybele, while that of religiosus seems to refer to a special category of worshippers, entirely devoted to the Great Mother. A list of musigmatau is contained in an inscription from Sophia, which seems to attest a particular initiatory grade, with the mention of a mu epsilon eta sigma, omicron lambda delta omicron. Finally, we should keep in mind that, according to the interpretation of certain monumental remains proposed by Picard, the city of Vienne in France appears to have been the site of a sanctuary of Cybele, with a theater for the celebration of mysteries. We cannot, however, assert the existence of genuine mysteries solely on the basis of architectural traces, whose identification has anyhow met with serious objections. The presence of sacred representations, suggested by the existence of a theater in the precincts of the sanctuary, or attested by literary sources such as the Scholiast to Nicander's Alexipharmacon, or Hippolytus who refers to the sacred hymns recited in the theaters by the Cytherists, does not necessarily imply a mystery context with individual initiation and esotericism. On the contrary, we know that even the Megalensia, the great patrician festivals in honor of the Mother of the Gods in Rome, included the performance of Ludi Scenici which, at a late period, also contained mimed representations of the Phrygian myth. A typical ritual object in use in the mystery cults, the Systa Mystica, in which were kept the Hiera and which recurs in certain Cybele's monuments, probably constitutes an allusion to the esoteric aspects of the Phrygian cult. Apart from the great cyst of the Archigallus of Osteomodius, this ritual object appears amongst the various cultic symbols present in the bas-relief of the Gallus at the Capitoline Museum and in the funeral monument of Valerius Firmus, priest of Isis and Cybele at Ostia. A cyst surrounded by a serpent stands close to the feet of the Archigallus lying on the lid of the sarcophagus found at the Portus Romae, and a specimen of considerable proportions appears on the seat of Cybele carried by the galley in procession as it is represented on an altar in London. If we turn to the literary sources, whether they be Christian or pagan, in the hope of finding elements useful for characterizing the Phrygian mysteries, the insufficiency of these sources becomes all too obvious, especially in relation to the problem with which we are most directly concerned, that of the soteriological prospects offered to the participants in this esoteric form of cult. Minucius Felix says that in the mysteries which are particularly esteemed and appreciated even by the cultivated pagans, all that is celebrated is exitus tristis, fata et funera e luctus atqua planctus miserorum diorum. Further on he talks of the Phrygian myth and the ritual connected with it, showing that he believes them to be part of the category of mystery cults, even if he is in fact referring to Cybele's love for Attis and the practice of the galley. According to Hippolytus, who reports the doctrines of the Nicene Gnostics, the Nicenes took part in the so-called mysteries of the Great Mother, and Arnobius, as we saw, says, in his exposition of the Phrygian version of the myth of Attis, that he is basing himself on the authority of the theologian Timotheus, who derived his information ex intimis mysteriis, in other words, from the secret doctrines of the mysteries. As for Julian, he distinguishes the ceremonies performed, according to mystic and secret laws, from the rites known to everybody. These are the March festivals whose performance he knows about according to the order illustrated by the Philocalian calendar. This has led some scholars to assume that the mysteries were celebrated in the same period, and that the esoteric rites thus coincided with the public ceremonies. It has also been assumed that the mystic and hidden ceremonies mentioned by Julian were in actual fact the gruesome rites of mutilation performed on the dies sanguinis by those worshippers who thus became part of the group. of Galli. Indeed, as we saw earlier, certain sources call the practice of the Galli mysteries. There is, for example, a fragmentary text contained in a recently discovered papyrus in which a gallus is mentioned in words which have a clearly mystery intonation. Even if the general character of the work in question seems decidedly satirical, the mention of pronounced by the gallus, of A and of A as a character to whom he turns is significant. This would confirm the fairly frequent use of a terminology of a mystery type applied to that particular sphere of the Cybele's religion occupied by the category of the sacred eunuchs. Only through very individual channels, and by retaining a significance all of its own, can this gruesome practice be fitted into the context of initiatory typology. At all events, although the time of year at which the esoteric ceremonies of the cult of Cybele were celebrated remains uncertain, their existence is confirmed by the documents cited. Difficult though they are to interpret, we find interesting indications of their ritual content in a passage of Clement of Alexandria, who mentions the symbolon of the Phrygian mysteries, the mystic formula pronounced in the course of the esoteric ceremonies. In his lively anti-pagan polemic, Clement talks of the mysteries of Deo. In this connection he evokes a complex myth whose protagonists are Zeus and Demeter, understood both as mother and wife of the god. These mysteries, he says, commemorate the amorous union of Zeus with his mother Demeter and the wrath of, let us say, Deo, who, it would appear, was called Brimo because of this, the supplications of Zeus, the cup of bile and the tearing out of the heart, and the infamous deed. He then tells us that the same things are performed by the Phrygians in honor of Attis, Cybele, and the Corybantes. He adds that the rest of the episode is well known. Zeus mutilated a ram and offered the animal's genitals to the infuriated goddess, almost as though he had mutilated himself as a punishment for the violence done to her. Is it necessary, Clement continues, to list the symbols of this initiation? I know full well that they would make you laugh even if you had no desire to do so from these attestations. I have eaten from the tympanum, I have drunk from the cymbal, I have borne the kernos, I have entered into the pastos. This passage is difficult to interpret because of the author's simultaneous reference to two mythical ritual complexes which are different but also, as he emphasizes, profoundly analogous. On the one hand we have what he calls the mysteries of Deo, and on the other the cult of Cybele and Attis. The relevance of the initiatory symbola to the Phrygian mysteries rather than to those of Deo emerges from a comparison with the text of Firmicus Maternus, to which we shall return later. For the time being we should inquire about these mysteries of Deo, which according to Clement are essentially analogous to the secret rites celebrated by the Phrygians in honor of Cybele and Attis. The mythical vicissitude underlying them does not reveal any connection with the Eleusinian milieu but reminds us rather of those Orphic circles which speculated variously about the true identity of the female deity with a maternal character with whom the male principle of the universe, Zeus, is in some way connected. She is called Rhea in as far as she is the mother of the god, Demeter in so far as she is his wife. These speculations at the same time are connected with the myth of the birth of Dionysus and of his murder by the Titans. It is to this that Clement is alluding when he mentions the tearing out of the heart and the infamous deed, although no other source seems to contain the mythical detail about Zeus simulating a mutilation to placate the resentment of Demeter Rhea, forced to undergo an undesired wedding. The elements which led the Christian polemicists to identify the Orphic myth, to which in some cases a mystery practice is linked, with the Phrygian rites and the relevant mythical traditions are, at least in part, fairly obvious. For on the one hand Cybele was commonly identified with Rhea, and on the other a certain religious tradition was acquainted with the assimilation of Cybele and Demeter, so that a polemical observer of pagan myths could jump to the conclusion that there was a substantial identity between the Phrygian goddess and the Rhea Demeter of the Orphic tradition. To this we can add that the theme of mutilation was very much present in the mythical ritual context of Cybele and Attis. The mystic formula cited by Clement in his complex disquisition on the subject can be referred to the Phrygian mysteries, rather than to the Orphic ones, thanks to the parallel attestation of Firmicus Maternus,
who writes in quodam templo, ut in interioribus partibus homo moriturus posit admitti, disi de tympano manducavi, de cymbalo bibi. Religionis secreta pereditsi, quod Graeco sermon dicitur tibanu vevroca, ecim valup epoca, iegona mistis theos.
If we pass on to the examination of the two testimonies, we see at once that while the first part of the formula is identical in Clement, and in the two versions reported by Firmicus Maternus, the conclusion is different in all three cases. The first ritual acts which the initiate claims to have accomplished do not give rise to any particular difficulty. They consist in eating and drinking from the sacred instruments which we know to be typical of the cult of Cybele. These acts can be seen as constituting a mystic meal by way of which a special bond of familiarity is laid between man and the goddess. It fits into a well-known typology, attested as it is in various mystery cults from Eleusis to Mithraism. As for the content of the meal, it is not easy to reach any conclusion. It has been suggested that bread and wine were consumed, although this has not been confirmed in any source, or fish. Rather than advance gratuitous theories, we should look at the attestation of Solustius who, as we saw, talks of milk drunk by the worshippers. He does not explain, however, whether the drinking of the milk takes place on the occasion of the public rites or at the esoteric ceremonies, even if the general context of his arguments would point to the former rather than the latter. While the formula reported by Firmicus Maternus in the Latin version concludes with a somewhat vague expression, with the initiates claiming to have taken part in the secrets of the mysteries, in the Greek version it contains an explicit reference to the acquired quality of mists of Attis. Of the two other ritual acts mentioned in the Cybele known to Clement of Alexandria, the first consists in carrying the kernos. Even if the kernophoria is a ceremony variously connected with the cult of Cybele, we know nothing of the content of the vase carried by the would-be initiate into the mystery rite. According to the Scholium to the Alexipharmacon, the kernos in the Phrygian cult contained lamps. This remains the only positive testimony on the subject, apart from the many inferences suggested. The next ritual act is expressed with the formula P taunu P alpha sigma taunu P delta epsilon, which has given rise to very different interpretations. For some scholars, this expression refers to the initiate's entry into a sacred building in order to celebrate a rite implying the performance of a mystic wedding with the goddess, in imitation of Attis. Others exclude a nuptial symbology in the Phrygian mysteries, and believe rather that they imply the admission of the worshipper in an inner and more secret room of the temple to receive the highest initiation, owing to the double meaning of the term pastos, nuptial chamber or cell of a temple. The second interpretation seems to me the most acceptable in view of the fact that the mythical tradition, with the exception of the euhemeristic version reported by Diodorus and the heavily ironical allusions of the Christian polemicists and pagan satirical writers, does not include a marriage between Cybele and Attis. It also finds some confirmation in the words with which Firmicus Maternus introduces the mystery formula. It has to be pronounced so that the candidate can be admitted in interioribus partibus, that is, into the recesses of the sanctuary. The symbolon, in the form adopted by Clement, would sum up the entire initiatory iter, including the access to the inner part of the temple to which Firmicus Maternus alludes with the expression quoted. Our sources do not contain any explicit statement about the prospects open to the mystai of Cybele and Attis. It is probable that the worshippers expected some benefits from their participation in the rites of mysteries. A more intimate familiarity with the Great Mother, the divine principle of natural fertility, could surely offer some guarantee of prosperity and well-being. Yet there is little basis in the documents in our possession for the idea, so frequently advanced, that the mists of Attis was submitted to a ritual containing a symbology of death and resurrection to a new life. To support this theory, reference is normally made to Firmicus Maternus, who calls the man who accedes to the Phrygian mysteries Moriturus, and to the words of Solustius, according to whom the act of drinking milk after fasting is performed by the worshippers as by men born anew. We have already discussed the significance of Solustius' report. It refers anyhow to the public ritual of the March festivals, and not to the mysteries. As for the attribute Moriturus in the work of the Christian polemicist, it reflects the condemnation of the pagan cults which he believes to contain spiritual death for man, and should not be seen as an allusion to a rite entailing the mystic death of the would-be initiate. Indeed, Firmicus refers to the ritual acts of drinking and eating mentioned in the symbolon of the mysteries of Attis, and says that whoever performs them has drunk a deadly poison, cibum istum mors sequitur semper et poena. Once the theory of a spiritual rebirth achieved in the esoteric ritual practice by way of identification with an Attis resurrected in his turn has been rejected, the problem of possible soteriological prospects in an eschatological sense in the cult of Cybele still remains open. For a deeper investigation of this problem, it will be necessary to consult different evidence, since those testimonies explicitly referring to the mystic and mystery cult of Cybele and Attis have proved inadequate. Ever since its earliest manifestations, the mystic quality of the mythical ritual complex of Cybele appears certain, and the attestation of an esoteric initiatory practice entitles us to speak of mysteries in the Phrygian cult in the situations and forms so far examined. As we have seen, however, with the exception of Damascius's late report, the relevant sources tell us nothing about benefits, for the present and future life, promised to the initiates. Nor is it permissible to attribute to the sphere of the mysteries those indications or explicit attestations of soteriological or specifically eschatological prospects, which can also be detected in the cult of Cybele. If this relationship does not emerge from the documents themselves, I shall not posit a necessary connection between mysteries and eschatology. I shall, however, try to detect in the cult of Cybele all the possible traces of concepts both of the future destiny of man and of positive prospects in this life. Chapter 5. Soteriological prospects in the cult of Cybele. The analysis conducted hitherto has yielded little concerning the problem of the advantages offered to the worshipper by the celebration of the cult of the Great Mother Cybele. If the earliest mystic forms of this cult in classical Greece appeared to confer on man that state of bliss achieved in the practice of an enthusiastic orgiastic ritual, in a direct relationship with the deity, we have no indication as to the particular prospects from which the members of those of Cybele's communities with an esoteric initiatory practice in the Hellenistic era thought they would benefit. The spring festival cycle in honor of Cybele and Attis, of Phrygian origin and institutionalized in the Roman world after the 1st century AD, in the March ceremonies, has revealed its quality as a mystic cult, re-evoking a divine vicissitude in which the god is subject to crisis, disappearance, and death, but also to survival in his capacity as guarantor of vegetal fertility and his effective presence in the practice of the rite. Our sources do not bother to tell us what reflections this cultic celebration had on the condition of the worshippers, even though they give a rich, detailed, and lively illustration of the emotional intensity with which the adepts participated. The abundance of blessings on an earthly and collective level can be considered the main benefit sought by the celebration of such a cult, bound so closely in its original forms to the idea of the promotion of fertility. The character of the goddess as guarantor of natural fertility, expressed in her epithet meter and in the original mountainous and rustic setting peculiar to her, progressively adopted a series of Demetrian aspects in the sense of a connection with the agrarian rhythms and with the crops themselves. This emerges from the late iconography of the goddess and from the attributes of Cereria and Agraria which designates Cybele in certain parts of the empire. Nevertheless, notwithstanding this insistence on her faculty as dispenser of fruits of the earth, we cannot deny that, as the result of the general religious development in the Hellenistic Roman period, participation in the March ritual acquired a different and more personal meaning in the eyes of the individual worshipper who re-evoked the divine vicissitude. In view of the lack of positive attestations, a methodological caution advises us to withhold from defining the specific content of the hopes, which could arise from participating in the interaction between the divine and human level achieved in that cult. The testimony of Damascus, late though it is, can, as we said, be considered an indication of this development of the religious concepts connected with the cult of Cybele and of the soteriological prospects which it could offer to the adept in the public form of the March festivals. The sources relating to the Phrygian mysteries of the Roman period do not allow us to reach any conclusion on the problem in question. It is not to the cult of Cybele that we can attribute the mystery formula reported by Firmicus Maternus in which the mysti of the rescued god are told to rejoice in the hope of themselves obtaining new sigma tau iter alpha. On the other hand, it is difficult to decide on the meaning of the formula Pirho sigma omega tau iter alpha, which ends the long dedication made to the meter aurea by the religious association based in the sacred caves of Juvaja. It is part of the language common to religious epigraphy, and it is impossible to decide whether the dedicators expected from their divine protector only a guarantee of earthly and material order, or also salvation of a spiritual and eschatological nature. We should consequently turn to another type of document which illuminates other aspects of Cybele's personality and can contribute to defining the picture of the benefits bestowed by her to a man both in the present life and in an eschatological perspective. Invoked by Pindar in the third Pythian ode for the health of Hieron of Syracuse, the Great Mother appears frequently as a healing deity, from Diogenes Tragicus who defines her to the euhemeristic version of Diodorus who shows Cybele capable of healing children's diseases with her kapalpha thalpha omicron, and the inscriptions of the Piraeus in which the worshippers turn to her as a whole series of attestations underline these medical capacities which extend to the flocks and which give rise, in the Latin West, to frequent identifications of the Magna Mater with local deities connected with thermal springs. Above all, the goddess is the purifier of that mania which she herself is capable of inspiring, both as the beneficial possession produced by her cult and as the terrible and destructive expression of her wrath. It is to this healing faculty that the epithet refers which is sometimes attributed to the mother of the gods. She can therefore be situated in the category of the savior gods, beneficent healers and guarantors of the well-being of their worshippers, so numerous in the Hellenistic Roman period amongst the traditional deities of Greco-Roman paganism and amongst the Oriental divinities. Yet the documents which attest that epithet of Cybele do not allow us to attribute to it that more extensive significance in a spiritual or eschatological sense which it nevertheless started to acquire in late antiquity. It is with the risks of navigation and war, for example, that we can identify the great dangers from which a certain Marcus Sigmopsilon Mubati Omicron of the Gallus Soterides, who had invoked for him the assistance of his divine patron, was saved, thanks to the benevolent protection of the goddess. We should now inquire into whether the notion of protection and well-being bestowed by the goddess in connection with the physical health of the worshippers, and in a wider sense with their earthly condition, is accompanied in other aspects of her cult by the notion of a guarantee for a future life. The function of Cybele as protectress of tombs, as it emerges from the ancient Phrygian rock monuments according to the interpretation proposed by Ramsay, has often been emphasized. Yet such monuments, as we have said, seem rather to be the sites of a cult without a precise funerary reference. At the same time, however, it is certain that in the Roman imperial period, The Great Mother and Attis appear frequently among the divinities invoked as guarantors of the inviolability of graves in many localities in Asia Minor. Numerous inscriptions from Smyrna prescribe the payment of a tribute to the Mater Theon Cybele on the part of whoever violated the dispositions established by the proprietor of the monument with regard to the grave itself. The Mother of the Gods is also indicated as the recipient of the fine in the grave inscriptions of 2 Archigalli of Termissus. Countless inscriptions in the Neo-Phrygian language contain deprecatory formulas against the violators of tombs, the interpretation of which remains largely uncertain. But we frequently come across the name of Attis in a context which indicates quite clearly his quality as protector of the tomb. The same function is attributed to the goddess and expressed both in the form of the dedication to her of the, in other words of the grave itself, and in the symbolism of the representation. The image of the lion, for example, recurs frequently on the tombstone, as does that of the goddess herself accompanied by the animal. The fairly widespread custom of placing the grave under the protection of a deity is in keeping with the need to guard the earthly dwelling of the deceased from violations. It does not necessarily entail the idea that the protective action of the divinity also acts on the destiny of the soul in the life to come. At all events, the documents cited attest a fairly frequent connection of Cybele and Attis with the sphere of death and burial in their Anatolian homeland. Also in the east, though not in Asia Minor, we have, on the slopes of Mount Stavron overlooking Antioch, in the area of a necropolis, a rock sculpture of the Roman imperial era representing 2 characters, a bust and a complete figure interpreted respectively as Cybele and Attis. The monument seems to have a funerary character and would confirm the quality of the 2 deities as custodians of the tomb. This same quality also persists in the west, where it is expressed in the presence of images of the 2 gods in funerary ornaments. As we know, terracotta statuettes of Attis have come to light in large quantities in the necropolises of Amphipolis in Macedonia and of Myrina. The presence of the Phrygian headdress has led Robinson to identify, albeit with reservations, the seated boy represented in a terracotta deposited in a tomb at Olynthus with Attis. In Abydos on the Hellespont, a statuette of Cybele has been discovered in a tomb, while from the necropolis of Phanagoria comes a terracotta image of the boy Attis with bird and dog. The necropolises of southern Italy have yielded other examples of Attis, and from the Carthaginian necropolis of St. Monica we have a clay statuette in which we can probably recognize the image of Cybele rather than that of Astarte, as Pharaon will have it. At the same time, however, it is certain that in the Roman imperial period the Great Mother and Attis appear frequently among the divinities invoked as guarantors of the inviolability of graves in many localities in Asia Minor. Numerous inscriptions from Smyrna prescribe the payment of a tribute to the Mater Theon Cybele on the part of whoever violated the dispositions established by the proprietor of the monument with regard to the grave itself. The Mother of the Gods is also indicated as the recipient of the fine in the grave inscriptions of 2 Archigalli of Termissus. Countless inscriptions in the Neo-Phrygian language contain deprecatory formulas against the violators of tombs, the interpretation of which remains largely uncertain. But we frequently come across the name of Attis in a context which indicates quite clearly his quality as protector of the tomb. The same function is attributed to the goddess and expressed both in the form of the dedication to her of the, in other words of the grave itself, and in the symbolism of the representation. The image of the lion, for example, recurs frequently on the tombstone, as does that of the goddess herself accompanied by the animal. The fairly widespread custom of placing the grave under the protection of a deity is in keeping with the need to guard the earthly dwelling of the deceased from violations. It does not necessarily entail the idea that the protective action of the divinity also acts on the destiny of the soul in the life to come. At all events, the documents cited attest a fairly frequent connection of Cybele and Attis with the sphere of death and burial in their Anatolian homeland. Also in the east, though not in Asia Minor, we have, on the slopes of Mount Stavron overlooking Antioch, in the area of a necropolis, a rock sculpture of the Roman imperial era representing 2 characters, a bust and a complete figure interpreted respectively as Cybele and Attis. The monument seems to have a funerary character and would confirm the quality of the 2 deities as custodians of the tomb. This same quality also persists in the west, where it is expressed in the presence of images of the 2 gods in funerary ornaments. As we know, terracotta statuettes of Attis have come to light in large quantities in the necropolises of Amphipolis in Macedonia and of Myrina. The presence of the Phrygian headdress has led Robinson to identify, albeit with reservations, the seated boy represented in a terracotta deposited in a tomb at Olynthus with Attis. In Abydos on the Hellespont, a statuette of Cybele has been discovered in a tomb, while from the necropolis of Phanagoria comes a terracotta image of the boy Attis with bird and dog. The necropolises of southern Italy have yielded other examples of Attis, and from the Carthaginian necropolis of St. Monica we have a clay statuette in which we can probably recognize the image of Cybele rather than that of Astarte, as Pharaon will have it. If this identification is correct, the little Carthaginian monument enriches still further the documentation which illustrates the function of the goddess as protectress of the deceased. This function probably accounts for the presence of Cybele in the extreme right-hand side of a funerary slab found in Tuscany, in which is represented the banquet of the heroicized deceased. The identification of the Phrygian goddess with the majestic female figure seated on a throne with a high back is probably correct owing to the presence, above the parapetsma which forms the background of the entire scene, of 3 figures with a helmet and a broad shield, in whom we can recognize the Corybantes, according to the scheme of the which recurs with a certain frequency in the monuments of the Cybele cult. Owing to its stylistic characteristics, the relief has been dated in the Hellenistic era, of Greek workmanship. It was probably imported into Italy in the Roman period. That series of funerary monuments, so numerous in Gaul and in Germany, but also present in Italy and other regions of the empire, which bears the image of a character in Phrygian dress usually identified as Attis, seems to have the same value. It is the type of the so-called Attis tristis which, rather than a prospect of happiness in the afterlife, stresses the moment of grief and mourning. The situation of the deceased is thus apparently connected with that aspect of suffering and of death, which characterizes to a large extent the vicissitude of the young Phrygian shepherd. An analogous significance seems to be assumed by the representation of Attis as winter in some sarcophagi decorated with the symbols of the 4 seasons. The salient characteristic of the figure is the moment of disappearance and concealment, connected with the sleep of the vegetation in the winter season. The image of Attis in the usual attitudes of grief is accompanied, in a figurative stele from Cologne, by that of Dionysus. It expresses the component of mourning and death in a context centered on the theme of the disappearance and seasonal return of vegetation and fertility. Needless to say, this aspect does not exhaust the significance of his personality and cult. Attis, as we saw earlier, is subject in his quality of mystic god to a vicissitude characterized by the convergence and the typical alternation of the moment of grief and the moment of joy, of disappearance and presence. This explains why, in the figurative documents, the image of Attis tristis alternates with that of Attis hilaris and the winter symbology of the Phrygian god with the spring one. In this context, I should mention, together with Vermasseron, a representation of Attis as spring on a Roman sarcophagus. All I wish to do is to stress, in connection with the funerary theme, that the moment of mourning in the vicissitude of Attis constantly takes precedence over the joyful moment of the return. There is little room, however, for the hypothesis of a specific link of that same theme with ultimate positive eschatological prospects. This interpretation of the iconographical theme of the funerary Attis would seem to be confirmed by a Roman metrical inscription pertaining to the Phrygian Hector, who appears as an adept of Cybele and Attis. While this document emphasizes the basically sad tone of the cult, it also recalls the past joys of earthly life, which are contrasted with the vision of the Cineris as an object of lamentation. There is no prospect of happiness in the hereafter, however. Van Doren believes that the character mentioned in this inscription is a Gallus, and he consequently defines him as an initiate of the highest grade. The absence of any reference to a life of bliss in the hereafter, on the other hand, leads him to conclude, in contradiction with his definition of the character, that the Phrygian cult of the 1st century AD had not yet assumed the form of the mysteries. For he believes that these consisted essentially in the promise of eschatological happiness, without repeating what has already been said about the special position of the category of the Galli in the cult of Cybele. We should simply note that, while the character's quality of sacred eunuch cannot be deduced from the inscription in question, it does evoke a cult with clearly funereal and doleful features, in which Attis is the object of a ritual dirge. The worshipper who has participated in this cult does not seem to expect anything after death other than the compassionate memory of those who were his companions in the celebration of the rite. No consolatory prospect illuminates his condition in the shadow of the grave which covers him. A similar situation seems to emerge from another funerary inscription, made for a child termed of various deities, amongst whom, in addition to the Bona Dei, Dionysus and Hermes Hegemonios, appears the child has piously performed the sacred mysteries of all these deities. But apart from this, there is not a word of hope to compensate for the premature death of the child who has abandoned the sweet light of the sun. All we have is the painful certainty that nobody can loosen the thread of the moire. Nor is there any allusion to prospects in the hereafter in 2 funeral odes in the Anthologia Palatina, both written in memory of women, devotees of Cybele. The first, composed by Philodemus, a contemporary of Cicero, recalls the courtesan Tryphera, assiduous in the orgiastic cult of the Mother of the Gods. The second, by Thielos, evokes the enthusiastic atmosphere of that cult by describing Aristinas in the act of dancing to the sound of the crotala and the flute, by the light of the torches. Now that the furies of the orgia and of the nightly vigils are over, there remains the bitter reality of the tomb, beyond which the funeral epitaph holds out no eschatological hope. If silence can be eloquent, it certainly is in the case of the documents cited. They all refer to adepts of Cybele, and are all equally oblivious to special benefits in the future life guaranteed by such a religious status. In documenting the existence of positive eschatological prospects in the Phrygian cult, Cumont has provided another funerary inscription, of which he quotes a line which would seem to connect the practice of the cult with the certainty of a happy destiny in the hereafter. Sacra Cybele concrepui, Securus morte quiesco. Nevertheless, a direct examination of the epigraph brings to light various difficulties which advise a greater caution in drawing conclusions. The expression cited by Cumont, for one thing, is not to be found in the text in the form which he adopts, but is the result of a fusion of elements which are actually separated in the text. The deceased tells the passerby to pause and describes to him his principal occupations during his lifetime. He was an expert singer and horn player, and he was particularly proficient in making the sacred cymbals resound. There follow some very incomplete lines in which seem to contain exhortations and invocations to the living, and the inscription concludes with the hope that the character will be received by Dispater in the infernal regions. We are therefore dealing with the usual prospect of a dark and subterranean afterlife, without there being any indication of a special destiny reserved for the deceased in virtue of his earthly activities and in particular of his skill in the use of the Sacra Symbole, which could show him to be a devotee of the Mater. After having established the uselessness of grieving over death, the common lot of mankind, the character concludes his address with a statement of resignation and serenity, nihil doleo nec deest, ecor morte quiesco. The rest and certainty which the deceased enjoys are thus presented not so much in relation to a special condition of bliss connected with the practice of a salvific cult, but as the absence of the needs and troubles typical of earthly life. He has now crossed the threshold which awaits every man and beyond which, as so many funerary epigraphs testify, there is an eternal quaes. In spite of the interpretative efforts of various scholars, the identification of the Sanctissima Mater in a Roman inscription, whom the deceased asks to relieve him, a finibus Tartarius, remains uncertain. We do not have sufficient elements on which to base the hypothesis that the Mater here invoked is, as has been claimed, the Phrygian Great Mother, who would thus have the faculty of removing man from the gloom of Hades, and of offering him a positive soteriological prospect. I also regard the cognomena of certain devotees of Cybele in Gaul as too fragile an indication of eschatological hopes, although we have such words as Anthus, Quietus, Carpus, and Hilarius which do indeed display a far from negligible religious significance. Other sources too provide indications which suggest an eschatological possibility in the expectations of the worshippers of Cybele and Attis, even if it is not possible to establish a precise relationship between them and one or other of the two forms of the cult of Cybele. The Elysium described by Propertius as a blessed place where the sonorous harp makes music and the turbaned choirs dance to the Lydian lyre and to the cymbals of Cybele can appear as an essentially poetic image. What does reveal eschatological hopes connected with the practice of the cult of Cybele, on the other hand, is the representation of the myth of Alcestis and Admetus which, together with the symbols typical of that cult, adorns the sarcophagus of C. Junius Euhodus and Matilia Acti, the latter a priestess of the great mother of the gods of the colony of Ostia in the Antonine period. According to Cumont, the Vates Frugiae Matris, whose funerary inscription which links him with his wife, proclaims the idea of the celestial immortality of the soul, is a priest of the Phrygian goddess. We know, however, that this idea was widespread in late antiquity. It arose as the result of the conjunction of Pythagorean speculations and astrological beliefs, and found acceptance in numerous religious circles. If Cumont's interpretation is correct, therefore, we can only conclude that a devotee of the Great Mother accepted the notion of the celestial origin of the soul, and of its return to the upper spheres from which it had descended, without this implying a specific pertinence of this concept to the religious milieu of Cybele as such. It is along these lines, moreover, that we should interpret the statement in the epigraph of a funerary sippus adorned with the image of Attis Tristis, corpus habent cineris, animam caesar abstulit, aer. On the other hand, the possible connection of Attis with the idea of a celestial immortality of the soul could legitimately be situated in the process of profound transformation experienced by Cybele's young Peredros who, from a figure with chthonic and vegetal traits in the 3rd to 4th century AD, assumed, like the Great Mother herself, the features of a cosmic power with clearly marked astral connotations. One such feature, expressed figuratively in the famous image of the Attidean of Ostia, which shows the Phrygian god with a half-moon and radiate crown, is amply elaborated in the mysterio-Sophic interpretations of a Julian and a Sallustius, as well as in the solar one of Macrobius. The epithet of Menotyrannos, which seems to imply an identification with the lunar deity Men, and the qualification of Invictus which sometimes accompanies it, also stresses the transformation in an astral and cosmic sense of the deity in question. Cumont, analyzing the theme of the celestial sojourn of the soul, and above all the notion of the moon as the dwelling place of the deceased, noted that in some sepulchral monuments of Gaul the crescent moon is often surmounted by a pine cone. In some cases, it is this latter object which substitutes the astral symbol. He went on to attribute the same meaning to the two symbols, and recognized that the pine cone recurs in funeral art as the symbol of immortality. Attis's association with the pine tree led him to establish a specific relationship between that symbolism and the religion of Cybele, and to conclude that it is probably to this religion that we can attribute the transformation of the indigenous beliefs of Gaul concerning the relationship of the soul of the deceased with the moon. This too would have determined the spread of the motif of the pine cone in the sepulchral monuments in Gaul. Coumont's arguments were accepted by Boyance and by Picard who, in the light of the symbolism in question, analyses numerous new documents from the Balkans and from Gaul itself in which, besides the theme of the pine tree, we get that of the cone. If in these monuments the relationship with Attis and more generally with the cult of Cybele is unquestionable, however, we cannot say with any certainty that the symbolism of the pine cone can always be traced back to that cult, especially when there is no explicit evidence. We know, of course, that the pine cone also recurs in the figurative monuments relating to Sabazius and to men, as well as in the Dionysiac ones. Besides, as Robert emphasizes in connection with an Anatolian funerary monument containing a deprecatory formula of clearly Jewish origin, there is no necessary connection between the pine cone and the cult of Attis, since it is such a widespread symbol in funerary art. A precise reference to the idea of a blessed immortality, guaranteed by Cybele to Attis, and also promised to all the worshippers, has been detected in the iconographical motif of the bow, sometimes in the hand of the Great Mother, and sometimes carried by the members of her priesthood. Amongst the monuments in which this symbol recurs, accompanied in some cases by the poppy or the pomegranate, or substituted by them, we have a clay lamp from Rome, in which the goddess hands a leafy bough to Attis. An altar in London which shows the goddess with a basket full of fruit and a large branch, the large fresco of Via dell'Abbondanza in Pompeii, and various Roman coins with the figure of Cybele. The bough appears, together with the pomegranate, in the portrait of the Archigallus from Ostia, and in that of the Gallus of the Capitoline Museum. It is also carried by the priestesses standing by the effigy of the goddess in the procession represented in the painting from Pompeii mentioned above. Finally, a Roman sarcophagus shows a small Attis standing next to Cybele who is watching the contest between Apollo and Marsyas and holds in her right hand a large pine branch. A comparison with the celebrated episode in Virgil of Aeneas's descents into the infernal regions with the aid of the Sibyl's golden bow, which also guarantees the hero's return to earth, and with the symbology of the bow in the Eleusinian Mysteries, as illustrated by Servius, has led scholars to attribute an analogous mystic significance to the flowery branch which appears in the monuments of Cybele's cult. A pledge of the salvation from Hades procured by the goddess for Attis, it is also an image of the guarantees bestowed on the worshippers for their future life. A further indication of eschatological prospects in the cult of Cybele could be provided by the title of Collegium Salutare, adopted by the Association of Dendrophoroi, in an inscription from Beauvais of the time of Antoninus Pius. Carcopino believes that the attribute salutare expresses the idea of salvation in the life to come guaranteed by the Mother of the Gods with whose cult the College of the Dendrophoroi was closely connected. As the same scholar observes, however, the denomination of Collegium Salutare was commonly used to designate the most varied religious communities, besides being typical of funerary associations. It is therefore difficult to decide whether the title in question has assumed, in the context of Cybele's religion, the specific eschatological significance which Carcopino attributes to it, or whether, according to its more commonly accepted meaning, it expresses rather that guarantee of well-being and security in the present life which the membership of a community with both a professional and a religious character could offer to its members. We should also mention, moreover, the dedication made by C. Antonius Eutychus Archidendrophus to Attis pro salute sua. Here too it is impossible to know the specific meaning of the salus which the character expected from this divine protector. From the observations made hitherto it emerges clearly that the promise of blessed immortality, so frequently indicated as one of the fundamental elements of the cult of Cybele, does not seem to have had that importance or that central position usually attributed to it without sufficient evidence. In fact, we are faced with a series of documents whose significance is ambiguous to say the least, since it is always possible to have reservations about the specifically eschatological character of the symbolism of the funerary monuments or even in some cases about their pertinence to the mother's milieu. In this sense, the epigraph discussed above is emblematic. The deceased rests securely in death and recalls having made the sacred symbols resound, a statement which seems to evoke the better-known manifestations of the mystic orgiastic cult of Cybele. Although we cannot make any definite claims for a specific relationship between the practice of such a cult and the quiet enjoyed by man in death. Equally useless for our purpose is the reference to the chthonic quality of the great goddess, seen as the Mother Earth from whom every life issues only to return to her in the end. This notion, which has frequently been called upon to confirm the presence of eschatological hopes in the cult of Cybele and which, in the ancient sources, finds its clearest exemplification in the Precatio Terrae, actually expresses an essentially imminent and cyclical vision, in which there is no place for that beatific survival supposed to constitute the benefit offered by participation in the cult of the Great Mother. Needless to say, a notion such as that of Mother Earth or of a maternal divinity bestowing life is, in itself, far too vague. By referring to generic or even to psychological classificatory schemes, moreover, it removes from the religious context in question that specificity expressed in its complex history. its myths and the procedure of its cult which characterizes it as an object of historical research. Having said this, however, we must not go to the opposite extreme and deny the existence of an eschatological component in the cult of Cybele, the outlines of which should, rather, be specified in relation to the various aspects of the cult and in the broader picture of the soteriology expressed in it. Understood as a flexible complex of guarantees provided by participation in this cult, we should also note that a direct connection between mysteries and eschatological prospects cannot be demonstrated but only supposed by analogy with the Eleusinian context. Such an analogy would repose on a historical basis if, as seems likely, the formation of an initiatory esoteric structure first in the Hellenized cult of the Mother of the Gods, and then in the more directly Phrygian cult of Cybele in the Roman world, had taken place under the influence of the Eleusinian model. Nevertheless, while at Eleusis the future destiny of man was the salient feature of the entire religious complex ever since the earliest manifestations known to us, it does not appear that the eschatological moment ever had a central importance in the mysteries of Cybele, judging at least from the documents in our possession which are curiously silent on the subject. In other words, even if the promise of a better lot in the hereafter was offered to the mystae of Cybele and Attis, it does not appear to have been the primary and specific objective of the esoteric cult. Nor are these conclusions contradicted by the wish, formulated with sincere fervor by Julian at the end of the oration to the Mother of the Gods, that the end of his life might be painless and glorious, sustained by the hope of journeying to the goddess herself. As Cumont has demonstrated, the mention of hope, which recurs on other occasions in the works of Julian, displays a clear reminiscence of the Eleusinian formula familiar to him who had been initiated in the mysteries. On the other hand, in the author's cosmoscopic vision inspired by Neoplatonic premises, the return of the soul to the superior divine spheres from which it had descended into the body is the end, and the final goal of the whole vicissitude. The Great Mother, the figure of the supreme principle of all, can then rightly be regarded as the object of the eschatological expectations of the man who participates in this vision of the world. At the same time, a guarantee after death seems to be connected with the public forms of the cult, or rather with the category of the Galli, whose initiation was of a very particular kind and very different from that of the normal devotee who, after the ritual tier, acknowledged himself a atheos. Indeed, the testimony of Damasius, late though it is, speaks of a salvation from Hades in connection with the celebration of the Hilaria, and the mysterio-sophic interpretations of Julian and Sallust appeal to the March festivals. Although these authors do not mention a specific eschatological prospect for those who participate in such ceremonies, they nevertheless draw from them, and from the myth on which they are based, an argument for that grandiose cosmological vision, which illustrates platonically the destiny of the divine entity with faculties demiurgic and medial, and at the same time the destiny of the soul, its descent into matter and generation and its return to the divine level. It is the mythical ritual scheme of the great festivals of Cybele which provides the elements for this Sophic elaboration, and not the esoteric rites which, if they were indeed exclusively connected with the idea of a blissful destiny in the hereafter, or if they did have a specifically soteriological value, would have appeared better suited to such an interpretation. Augustine finally mentions the typical context of religious exaltation and organism inherent in the public cult of the Magna Mater in order to ask polemically how all this could give rise to a promise of eternal life. If, as Lagrange maintains, this passage attests the existence of such a prospect in the cult of Cybele, we must admit that it concerned the public component of the cult at least as much as the esoteric one. In Augustine's text, the emphasis is primarily on the figure and behavior of the Galli who, in the pagan authors and the Christian polemicists, are the favorite target of a biting criticism directed at the crude and barbarous aspects of religious enthusiasm in the exotic cults. For the Galli in particular, there would indeed appear to have been a prospect of future bliss according to another passage in Augustine, where the dissolution of the present life of the sacred eunuchs is contrasted with the happiness post-mortem at which their consecration would be aimed. Prudentius, moreover, mentions the vulnerem crudelitas of the fanaticus of Cybele as something which is thought to deserve heaven. Lagrange, who cites these passages, believes that the notion of a happy lot in the hereafter reserved for the Galli should be connected with the expiatory character of the practice of eunuchism. Quite apart from the significance of this practice, which this is no place to discuss, we have seen that its connection with a positive eschatological prospect is only suggested by Augustine and Prudentius, authors who, in the context of the anti-pagan polemic, can be suspected of having accentuated the contrast between the soteriological claims of the Phrygian cult and its specific procedure. This consists in typical manifestations of orgiasm, frequently associated with the figure of the Galli, whose immoral behavior was also stressed as a distinctive element. These, furthermore, are late sources. They reflect an extreme point in the evolution of the cult of Cybele which, before declining forever, seems to have gathered around itself. The last manifestations of pagan religiosity, in a lucid and lively effort to resist the ever more powerful advances of Christianity, The rite of the taurobolium was a major expression of this role assumed by the Phrygian cult, which was now so perfectly assimilated by the Western world as to appear as the emblematic form of the traditional religion of the empire, and it is to the taurobolium that I shall now turn in order to illustrate a last aspect of the varied and composite picture provided by the cult of Cybele. Chapter 6. Mystic and Soteriological Aspects of the Taurobolium. We are all familiar with the complex problems of the origins and the history of the taurobolium, which appears, together with the cryobolium usually connected with it, as an important component of the cult of the Great Mother of the Gods in the Roman world after the mid-2nd century AD. Dutoit's recent analysis has focused the question by providing a brief but exhaustive synthesis of the various interpretations proposed, which it would be absurd to sum up at this point. Even if some scholars thought that there was an original connection between the taurobolium and the cult of Cybele, while others maintained that the rite had been borrowed from a different religious sphere, everybody was acquainted with those epigraphic documents which, already in the 2nd century BC in Asia Minor, and the first half of the 2nd century AD at Pozzuoli, attest the practice of taurobolia and cryobolia outside the Cybele's cult. It is only after 160 AD, with the inscription of lions which mentions a taurobolium of the Great Mother of the Gods Idea, celebrated ex imperio by the goddess herself, that the rite appears to be connected with Cybele. From then on it becomes a phenomenon pertaining exclusively to her, though Attis is also sometimes mentioned next to her, nor did anyone fail to notice the distinction between the various forms of the rite, at least as far as its destination was concerned. One was of a public character, the taurobolium being celebrated for the health of the emperor, and often for other members of the imperial house as well, in some cases for the welfare of the entire civic community. The other was of a private character. We only get the name of the dedicator, without there being any mention of the beneficiary of the rite, who was probably the dedicator himself. At other times it is explicitly stated that a person has received the taurobolium, or according to a later verbal formula, that he has been tauroboliated. As for the details of the rite, apart from some indications provided by the formula of the inscriptions placed to record its celebration, what was usually used by scholars was the vast and colorful description of the parastephanon, which, as we know, presents it as a sort of baptism of the devotee with the blood of the animal. Dutoit's study, based on former research and significant evidence of this type, has shown that the distinction between the public and private taurobolia is insufficient if we overlook the historical perspective, which includes a development of the rite in question, with deep transformations of both the form and the purpose. In other words, emphasizing the considerable differences in the formula used in the taurobolium dedications of various epochs, he detects an earlier type of taurobolium which appears as a sort of sacrifice in honor of the Mother of the Gods in favor of the emperor, the community, or the individual, and a more recent type to which Prudentius's description and the allusions in other literary sources of the 4th century must refer. And so the problem of the meaning of the rite in the general context of the cult of Cybele is well on the way to being solved. This is no place in which to repeat Dutoit's arguments or to discuss the viability of all his observations on the subject of that intermediary phase which would mark the passage from one type of taurobolium to the other. As he himself admits, his reconstruction of that moment is largely based on hypotheses in view of the scarcity of documentary evidence. We should simply note that in the 2nd and, up to a point, in the 3rd century AD, the taurobolium seems to have been a sacrificial rite with a specific character, evident from its exclusive pertinence to the cult of Cybele, its name, and perhaps certain ceremonial aspects connected with its original relationship with hunting and animal trapping. Substantially, however, it was akin to the common rite of sacrificing a victim to the deity, so as to derive protection and well-being for the social community, by way of the emperor, its highest representative, or for the individual. Indeed, in this period public and private taurobolia coexist without there being any perceptible difference in the celebration of one or the other, and above all, without there being any indication of the presence in the ritual of that sprinkling with the animal's blood so characteristic of the rite described by Prudentius. We should also note, however, that a particular treatment is reserved for the animal's vires. In the inscription from lions they are transferred from the Vatican, either the Roman hill on which the Phrygianum stood, or a place of the same name in the French city, in order, it would appear, to be buried under the altar commemorating the rite. 2 inscriptions from Lacter, undated but probably ascribable to the first phase of the taurobolium, record the consecration of the Virus Tauri. A great deal has been said about the significance of this ritual treatment, and discussions continue without either of the interpretations being acceptable with absolute certainty. At all events, it confirms the specificity of the taurobolium sacrifice as a rite pertaining to a religious context in which the practice of eunuchism and its mythical roots in the traditions concerning Attis confer a particular importance on this aspect of the cultic practice. As for the objectives of the taurobolium in this first phase, they seem to consist in a guarantee of well-being in the present life, as expressed in the formula pro salute, salus indicating not only physical health but all the values which confer security on the life of the individual and the community. It is along these lines that we can explain the celebration of the rite in favor of the emperor and on the special orders of the highest official representative of the cult of Cybele, the Archigallus. It thus became a manifestation of loyalty on the part of the individual or the civic community towards that civic power which, on the one hand, protected and regulated the cult and, on the other, enjoyed the effective benefits resulting from its practice. In the course of the 3rd century, however, while public taurobolium for the health of the emperor were still being celebrated, a new type of private taurobolium gradually asserted itself. And, in the 4th century, it was to become the only form in which the rite was performed, both because of the prevalence of the individualistic tendencies of that period and because of precise historical circumstances, the state now being ruled by Christian emperors, with the exception of the reign of Julian. The process by which this second and individual form of taurobolium was formed can only be reconstructed hypothetically, since there are no concrete historical elements on which to rest. Nevertheless, in the definitive form which it appears to have adopted by the beginning of the 4th century, it can be identified with the rite described by Prudentius and mentioned in the few contemporary literary texts. This rite raises the problem of its mystic and soteriological significance, both in order that we may gain an exact understanding of the religious values connected with the cult of Cybele, and in the broader perspective of the soteriology of the mystic cults of late antiquity. For it is the ritual act which, in the last years of paganism, seemed to constitute the highest sanction of the religious status of those representatives of the Roman aristocracy, who assumed the traditional priestly functions, and performed various initiations with the object of contraposing the sacredness of the religious traditions of their own forebears to the new religious message which was spreading ever further. In order to understand this significance, the ironical question which the anonymous author of the Carmen Contrapaganos put to his pagan interlocutor, a distinguished figure in the public life of Rome at the end of the 4th century, is decisive. If the brief reference to the details of the rite with the descent below the earth, pollutus sanguinitari, conforms fully to the description of Prudentius, that question tackles the theme of the efficacy attributed to the shedding of the bull's blood, vivere cum speras viginti mundus in annos. The tauroboliatus thus thinks that he has achieved purification. This purification, however, is circumscribed in time to those 20 years which seem to indicate a cycle of life, after which it is necessary to perform the rite again. This is confirmed by those inscriptions which commemorate the repetition of a taurobolium, even if they do not indicate the period which elapsed between the first and the second celebration. In one case, however, it turns out to have been 20 years. The Roman inscription of the Lateran recording a period of 28 years as a parenthesis of darkness which has been ended by the taurobolium, can probably be interpreted in relation to the years in which the Constantinian Basilica of St. Peter's was being built. Placed in the immediate vicinity of the Phrygianum, the movement of men and objects necessary for its construction would have prevented the celebration of the rites of Cybele. If the repetition of the rite after a fairly extensive, albeit defined, period of years is in keeping with the essentially cathartic character of the taurobolium blood bath, a new element is introduced in the words of a tauroboliatus who proclaims himself an aeternum renatus. Together with Moore and Nilsson, most scholars agree in recognizing this declaration, not so much as the sign of a doctrine which attributed unlimited efficacy to the rite, perhaps after it had been repeated, but as the expression of an individual devotion of a particularly lively and enthusiastic kind. Apart from the theme of duration, whether limited or indefinite, of the beneficial effects of the taurobolium, it emphasizes a particular aspect of these effects, that of the regeneration which the rite will obtain for man. We may now ask what the sense of the rebirth is which the devotee thinks he has experienced as a result of celebrating the taurobolium. As against the views of Loisy, Lagrange has demonstrated that there is no evidence for connecting the taurobolium with Attis, whose experience of death and subsequent resurrection the tauroboliatus repeats by descending into the pit to receive the blood of the animal. It is superfluous to recall that the lateness of the document in question limits its value for determining the primary or the acquired character of the concept of rebirth in connection with the rite, making the second possibility more likely. We should keep in mind, however, that some inscriptions, two of which are dated at the end of the 2nd century AD, mention, in connection with the taurobolium or the creobolium, a natalis or natalicium, on the meaning of which scholars differ. Some have seen the natalicium as the day of the celebration of the rite, understood as the moment marking the devotee's spiritual birth. Others, instead, think it is an anniversary of physical birth, selected for the celebration of the taurobolium. In the case of Valeria Avita, who dedicates to the Mother of the Gods the altar Tauroboli sui natalici rediti, and of an unknown individual who records having restored Art obi natalicium IOSS, we can probably choose between one or other of the interpretations suggested. We cannot exclude the possibility that the worshippers in question had chosen their own birthday to perform the rite. This possibility, however, appears less likely in the case of the two Irenei, father and son, who call themselves Creobolati Natal, Suo and Pax Iulia, for we would then have to presume the exceptional circumstance that the birthdays of father and son fell on the same date, Moreover, the choice of one's own dies natalis for the performance of the taurobolium and the cryobolium, if the documents cited can indeed be interpreted in this sense, would be equally significant and justify the hypothesis that this coincidence assumed in the eyes of the worshipper a precise religious value. In other words, we would have as a counterpart to physical birth that renewal of vital and spiritual energies produced by the purifying effect of the taurobolium or cryobolium bath conceived as a new birth. At all events, nobody can doubt that, at least in the case of the Roman inscription discussed above, the idea of a spiritual rebirth is connected with the taurobolium. Consequently, in the last days of paganism, and particularly in those circles of the Roman aristocracy which contributed with sincere fervor to its renewal, the taurobolium was also regarded as a ritual act capable of procuring for the participant the certainty of being reinatus. Indeed, this notion displays a certain continuity with the cathartic effect which the taurobolium, in its form of a bath of blood, seems to present in its basic and essential connotation. If the purification obtained by the rite is felt as the beginning of a new life, the sign of a renewal of present existence and a guarantee for the future one. That the cathartic effect of the taurobolium was not of a purely ritual order, at least in those pagan circles of the 4th century where it was particularly popular, but assumed important ethical aspects, is shown by the language of certain dedicatory epigraphs of the taurobolium altars. Thus, for example, the already cited Lateran altar claims to bring as a sacrificial offering the works, thought, behavior, superior life, all that is good in the soul of the worshipper. In the inscription placed in remembrance of the rite, Clodius Hermogenianus defines Cybele and Attis, with whom Hermes is also associated, as Dion animax sui mentis custodes, and Sionius Rufius Volusianus calls them great gods and his protectors, stressing the intimate and personal bond which ties him to the Phrygian deities. The connection of the Great Mother with the sphere of ethical values, moreover, already present in the metrical inscription of the sanctuary of Phaestus, must have fairly ancient Anatolian origins, if we consider that the observance of numerous precepts of both a ritual and a moral order imposed on the religious community of Philadelphia is guaranteed by the custodian of the dwelling, Agdistus, who makes sure that men and women have gamma phi theta delta iota alpha nu omicron alpha, and piously observe their religious duties. Finally, we should consider whether the taurobolium, having turned in the 3rd century from a sacrificial and expiatory rite into an essentially cathartic and individual one, also has initiatory aspects and can thus be placed amongst the mystic cults. There are no valid elements for establishing a relationship between the taurobolium and the mysteries of Cybele and Attis, despite the reconstructions attempted by various authors who wish to make room for this rite in the Mystery Iter. Its history, moreover, makes a direct and original connection between the two contexts more improbable than ever. Nor is there a link between the March Festival and the taurobolia, performed in the most varied periods of the year without there being any apparent coincidence with the festival cycle, except in a few rare cases. We know that the indication Initium Chiani in the Philocalian calendar for 28 March, formerly interpreted as referring to the celebration of the taurobolia after the close of that cycle, in fact has nothing to do with it. Nevertheless, the rite would assume a very individual initiatory character if, as some authors claim, the special treatment of the vires which takes place even in its earliest manifestations were a substitute for mutilation, as practiced by the Galli. It would then be a consecration of the man to the goddess performed by way of the animal. Yet it is hard to accept this interpretation in those cases so frequent, and actually prevalent in the earliest phase of the taurobolium, when the rite was performed at the expense and under the supervision of women, or in the case of the public taurobolia, pro salute imperatoris. At all events, if the initiatory character of the rite corresponded to that very particular type of initiation practiced by the Galli, it would have a different significance to that of a mystery cult. In certain taurobolium inscriptions of the 4th century, however, we have a language with clearly mystery connotations used to define the rite, and there is also a tendency to associate it with obviously mystic practices and cults. Thus the dedicator of the taurobolium altar of Athens, who, in the figurative representation associates Cybele with Eleusinian Demeter, records having participated in the mystic rites of Lerna, and says he is a deducus of Kore. He speaks of the taurobolium as of which the are evoked. A similar language appears in the second altar of Athens, itself defined, and in the Greek inscriptions on certain taurobolium altars in Rome. The taurobolium of Rufius Saonius, who amongst his religious functions numbers that of Hierophant of Hecate and Pater Sacrorum of Mithras, is called a mystic rite. In the celebrated inscription recording the many political and sacred functions performed by Vettius Agorius Praetextatus, his wife Fabia Aconia Paulina, who, following in her husband's footsteps, participated in the most important Greek and Oriental mystery cults, sees in her husband the mystagogue who introduced her to the bull's initiations. In the spiritual climate of an age of profound social and religious changes, those who remained true to the traditional religions found a basis for their own religiosity and their own world picture above all in the mystery cults through complex, Sophic interpretations of the myths and the rites contained in these cults. This feature would account for the obviously initiatory and mystic connotation assumed by the taurobolium. The rite, which drew its cathartic efficacy from shedding the blood of an animal, fitted into a religious context which on the one hand presented itself as the cult of a national deity, intimately connected with the destinies of Rome and the empire, and on the other was animated by a mystic religiosity both markedly individualistic and deeply felt, expressed in great public festivals, but also in esoteric and secluded rites. The taurobolium displays this duplicity of aspects throughout the course of its history. It was a public and official rite performed for the health of the emperor, and probably itself instituted within the cult of Cybele by an act of imperial religious policy, and it was a private rite, for the benefit of the individual. This second dimension, which was gradually to prevail, made it an initiatory rite in circles of the Roman aristocracy in the last part of the 4th century. Such a qualification, moreover, can be applied to the taurobolium in an extremely broad and analogical sense, since it lacks that esoteric character and that relationship with the divine vicissitudes celebrated cultically which characterizes the initiations of the mysteries. We could say that the taurobolium assumes a mystic connotation, through having been adapted by the worshipper himself to the other initiations in which he had participated, thereby acquiring a religiously defined status. The title of the tauroboliatus was thus situated, in the mind of the devotee, and in the concrete efficacy of his religious experience, in a homogeneous series of religious attributes with an initiatory and esoteric basis, initiate of Dionysus, of the Eleusinian goddesses, of Mithras, etc. Let this be said, however, without diminishing the objective differences between the celebration of the taurobolium and the mystery rites in question. Religious historical research will undoubtedly stress these differences with the object of obtaining a clear definition of the specific significance and of the morphology of the various contexts. But it must not lose sight of the process by which the rite of Cybele, starting with a sacrificial character, accentuated the individual and cathartic element to gather round itself a mass of religious and ethical values which made it appear, in certain circles in late antiquity, a cultic act capable of conferring an initiatory qualification and of procuring a sense of inner renovation. This latter sense is based on that element of individual purification inherent in the taurobolium, and fundamental to the initiatory practice of the most varied mystery cults, being one of its premises and also one of its specific objectives. We can therefore understand how, in this vast and flexible historical process, we can come across the statement, isolated though it is in our documentation, and very probably a sign of a personal religiosity rather than of a specific doctrinal element, but nonetheless relevant in its particular religious significance, that the tauroboliatus of the Mother of the Gods is in aeternum renatus. Because of this we can detect, in the objective structures of a rite with a complex history and with a crudely naturalistic procedure, an elevated soteriological value no longer limited to a cycle of earthly existence, but projected into an eschatological dimension. Conclusion. I shall end this analysis of documents by adding a few words about those considerations to which the various sources I have examined have given rise, and by summing up the general state of the problem. In view of the specific sense in which I have used the terms mystic and mystery, a sense which I defined at the beginning of this study, the reader is entitled to some conclusion about their applicability to the cult of the Great Mother in Attis, however different the various forms it adopted in time and space. We have indeed been able to observe that, despite the persistence of certain basic characteristics of the goddess and her ritual, the cult of Cybele does not present a uniform physiognomy. I refer, of course, above all to the orgiastic aspect of the ritual, with its attendant and typical manifestations of possession and mania which persist throughout its history, from the Hellenized forms of the prevalently female groups of the classical age, to the Phrygian ones of the mythical cultic cycle of Attis and the Galli. The cult appears rather as a flexible network of elements which do indeed have connections with one another, but which frequently develop along partly independent lines, at least in certain circles and historical situations. On the one hand, then, we have the religious complex gravitating round the Great Mother of the Gods as a divinity, in whom we can still perceive specific Oriental antecedents but who appears to have been fully integrated in the Greek religious sphere. In her cult, so widespread in Greece and the Hellenized world, we can detect, in the enthusiastic orgiastic moment, that mystic component to which I referred earlier, while in some places there are attestations, as from the Hellenistic period, of institutions of a mystery type including a specific initiatory practice. We have no way of knowing whether there was a continuous line of development from the former to the latter, or whether the latter can be fitted into that characteristic process which led, in the Hellenistic period, to the constitution of mystery structures and religious phenomena previously defined in a mystic sense, like the Dionysiac cult of the Thiasoi, so similar in many ways to the religion of Cybele, or like various Demetrian and Kabirian cults. Some influence or pressure of the Eleusinian model on the religious milieu of the Great Mother with the object of forming within it mystery institutions seems most likely. At all events, in the passage of the cult of the Great Mother from the mystic form, expressed in the moment of divine possession which is so typical of it, to the mystery form, attested in certain parts of the Greek world, we see the perexistence of those strongly Hellenized traits of the goddess personality and ritual which characterizes this aspect of her religion. After the 4th century BC, however, we find significant traces on Greek soil of the Phrygian elements of the cult and the myth, particularly when a male Preface Attis appears beside the goddess, and we hear of the ritual practices of the Galli. It is hard to reach any conclusion about the connections between these two components of the cult of the Great Mother Cybele. It would be going too far to lay such emphasis on the differences between them as to create a clear borderline between a completely gray-sized mother of the gods and a Cybele who has retained all her original Phrygian connotations, expressed in the mythical ritual complex gravitating round Attis. Neither of these images would truly correspond to the historical reality which knew peculiarly exotic traits in the solemn mother of the gods, a mountain goddess sovereign of an uncultivated world inhabited by beasts, the mistress of lions, venerated to the sound of sacred instruments producing a violent and orgiastic music. This is how she appears in the Homeric hymn to the mother of the gods. On the other hand, even the Phrygian forms of the cult of Cybele appear to have undergone a process of Hellenization on a mythical and ritual level. This is hard to assess in view of the impossibility of a comparison with Oriental sources relating to the original manifestations of that cult, but it was certainly active in the constitution of those same forms as they were handed down by the Greek world. Towards the end of the 3rd century BC, at all events, a new element intervenes in the complex history of the cult of Cybele, when the Roman aristocracy turns to Pergamum with a precise religious policy in mind, in order to receive from it the aniconic idol of the Great Mother of Finis. We then witness a process partially analogous to that which had taken place on Greek soil. If a series of spontaneous and autonomous cultural contacts between individuals and communities led to the introduction of the figure of the Phrygian goddess in the religious panorama of the Greek world, and to a more or less profound process of Hellenization of her character and her cult, the official accession of the Mater Magna Idea in Republican Rome entailed a rigorous selection of the elements composing the goddess's personality and ritual. We thus come to the constitution of a deity perfectly integrated in the Roman pantheon, considered the protectress of the city insofar as she was tied to the city's Trojan origins and had saved it when its very existence was threatened by foreigners. She consequently had her shrine on the Palatine, the heart of Romanized Rome, and was honored with annual patrician festivals, the Megalensia, celebrated according to the Mos Maiorum, but without any of the mystic orgiastic aspects of the Oriental cult. Nevertheless, a staff of Phrygian priests accompanied the goddess to Rome to celebrate her rites in the traditional manner within her sanctuary. Even at this, as far as we can see from the excavations performed by Romanelli in the area of the shrine of Cybele on the Palatine, they came to the city in train of the Great Mother. According to Cicero, the Phrygian priests were allowed to practice sacred begging on a particular date, and Dionysius of Halicarnassus describes a Phrygian couple, with sacred images on their breasts, wandering through the city to the sound of timpana and flutes. Despite the precautions of the civic authorities then, the people learned to know the Phrygian form of the cult of the Great Mother. There is no doubt that at the end of the Republican period and the beginning of the Empire, the general interest in Oriental religions was accompanied by an increasing popularity of that cult, for, from the reign of Claudius onwards, those same authorities thought it necessary to effect a series of reforms, introducing at successive moments into the public ritual the entire March festival cycle centered on Attis. The mythical ritual complex referring to Attis, both in the forms known in Greece and still more, in those of the Roman festivals of the imperial period, clearly displays the features peculiar to a mystic cult in its quality as a ceremony re-evoking the significant moments of a divine vicissitude, characterized by deep pathos but also orientated towards a positive outcome. Aside from Fraser's outdated scheme of the dying and rising god, Attis appears, insofar as he is the object of such a rite, as a figure subject to vicissitude, a divinity connected with the sphere of chthonic fertility, and most especially with arborescent and fluorescent vegetation. I believe that all the evidence examined hitherto, whether it refers to the myth or to the cult, points to this assessment of the religious historical consistency of this superhuman figure. In the Roman imperial period, the cult, as we have seen, also included the esoteric initiatory form of the mysteries. These, though definitely referring to the Great Mother Cybele, must have retained a privileged position for the young Preface, if the adept at the end of his ritual lighter acknowledged himself a mistus of Attis. The historical and typological relationship between the two aspects of the cult cannot be clearly defined in its specific details owing to the difficulty of deciding whether those esoteric forms only attained a later influence in the cult, already existed in an Anatolian environment before any contact with the Greek world. Nevertheless, the mass of evidence examined leads one to suspect that the formation of mysteries in the Phrygian cult was not an original element but a later addition, the result of an encounter with Greek religious structures familiar within the phenomenon in various forms. The basic cause of the formation of an esoteric initiatory ritual within that cult appears to have been its typical quality as a mystic cult in the sense which I explained earlier. The profound participation in the interaction between the divine, cosmic, and human levels, as it takes place in the public rites of March, and the re-evocation of a divine vicissitude which constitutes its essential structure, are elements morphologically analogous to the components of a mystery context of the Eleusinian type. We can therefore assume that owing to the pressure of the Greek religious model at a time when there was a prevalence of individualistic tendencies and an interest in cults with a private and secluded character, the mystic elements of the Phrygian cult were adapted to an esoteric initiatory ritual practice in which the personal aspect of the participation of the adept in the divine vicissitude took absolute precedence. Still more difficult is the problem of the soteriological content of the cult, in view of the diversity of its expressions in time and space. Here we return to the question, put at the beginning of the present study, about the religious historical definition of the concept of salvation. Without claiming to arrive at such a definition, for which it would be necessary to appeal to the widest possible range of religious phenomena, I have preferred to take as my starting point a fairly broad meaning of the notion in question, and to leave it up to the analysis of the cult of Cybele to reveal a formulation capable of characterizing the complex of advantages and guarantees which the adept could expect in that sphere. This task was not easy owing to the quality of the documentation available. There are no sources that can be directly ascribed to the original Anatolian context. Even the sacred writings of a later period, the works of Western authors interested in the religion of Cybele have, with a very few exceptions, been lost. Our evidence, then, is mainly reduced to brief allusions, often polemical or satirical, to authors of different periods and backgrounds, or to the testimony, sadly unexpressive from our point of view, of the figurative monuments or dedicatory epigrams from whose stereotyped formulas it is frequently impossible to reach any definite conclusions, even if the description of the ritual data can be considered sufficiently objective for the periods to which the various authors refer. The mythical traditions have reached us in such a state of elaboration that it is extremely difficult to appreciate their true religious significance behind the multiple accretions to which the most varied interpretations have led. However that may be, a first result of our research into the available sources has been to investigate the reliability of a formula which establishes an exclusive and necessary relationship between the form of the mysteries and the existence of positive eschatological prospects for the individual. Limited though the expressiveness of the documents may be, it has been possible to conclude that, while no source attributes a specific guarantee of immortal bliss to the initiate, those prospects are not completely absent from the cult of Cybele. Perceptible only at a fairly late period, however, they cover more or less indiscriminately the entire range of its religious manifestations, from the public form of the March ritual to the sacred eunuchs and, at least in Roman aristocratic circles of the 4th century, to the practice of the taurobolium, which can be viewed, albeit in a single case known to us, as a means of rebirth for all eternity. The guarantees of a positive destiny in the hereafter entitle us to speak of soteriology, unknown though it is to us in its specific details. As far as we can judge from our documentation, however, these guarantees do not seem to constitute a central and absolutely characteristic element of the religious sphere in question, but they may have matured in the course of time owing to the assimilation of widespread contemporary aspirations and tendencies. It is in this sense that, in the context of the accentuation of the cosmic aspects of the deities in question, in the forms illustrated by the Patera Parabiago and the Attis of Ostia, we can account for the presence of the idea of the celestial immortality of the soul in documents which can be related, even if only conjecturally, to the context of Cybele. A series of converging data reveal, moreover, a special connection with the freterrestrial situation of man, in the broader sphere of cosmic life, especially on a clonic and animal level. It is to this that the qualities and specific attributes of the Great Mother who dominates nature both in its uncultivated aspect and in its vital and fertile energies refer. The goddess's medical and cathartic faculties, particularly concerning her children and flocks, complete this perspective and account for the attribute of soitera which so frequently accompanies her. Her capacity to infuse mania turns into a beneficial possession which takes hold of the man who practices her cult, putting him into a state of bliss and illuminating his mind to worship the deity, a condition which reveals a particular aspect of the mystic consistency of the cult. But it is above all the mythical ritual complex relating to Attis, which expresses a religious vision based on the notion of the deity as a guarantor of cosmic existence. Indeed, however variously composed and elaborated the forms in which it has reached us, we are entitled to consult the Phrygian myth about the main significance of the religious context in question. That it is at least partially reliable is proved by its fundamental connections with the ritual practice which more faithfully retain the authentic and original religious values of that same context. The theme which runs through the so-called Phrygian version of the myth of Attis is really that of the divine origin of the vegetal elements making up the natural setting in which the characters move. The almond tree or the pomegranate is born from the earth fertilized by the blood of Aegisthus, and its fruit gives birth to Attis. Nana is fed by the mother of the gods with the fruits of this tree, or with acorns and figs. Attis's blood produces the violets surrounding the pine tree under which his mutilation took place. This mutilation, the cause of his death, is produced by a deity, Aegisthus. Just as the gods populating the initial scene of the episode had decided to mutilate their hermaphrodite Aegisthus in order to regulate her violent and disorderly vital energies. At the same time, the pine tree, which, in the mythical narrative, is the background of the tragic end of the vicissitude, is in actual fact an alternative expression and a privileged manifestation of the Phrygian god, as emerges from its cultic role, and the rich iconography in which Attis and the tree appear in intimate symbiosis. The idea is thus established that life and vegetal fertility spring from the death of a deity, and more precisely from parts of his body. This notion is expressed too in connection with the girl, the bride of Attis, who also meets a violent death as the result of mutilation and gives birth with her blood to the purple violets. According to Arnobius's version of the myth, it is from her tomb that the almond tree grows. We should observe, moreover, the association between vegetation and the wind, which, aside from the banal motif of Aegisthus's jealousy, is an essential component of the myth, the association of the sexual act and the power of procreation with death. These various elements, each of which could seem, at a first sight and out of the general context, the fruit of mythological elaborations based on the physical theories of late theologians, concur in their reciprocal interaction to form a unitary ideological structure, with an internal coherence and organicity, in which the notions of life, procreation, and death are intimately connected and exemplified in the vicissitude of a youthful subject to crisis and disappearance. This vicissitude is clearly reflected in the cultic practice. Indeed, the peculiarity of the Phrygian ritual cycle is its character of re-evocation of the various moments of Attis's pathos, as it is described in the corresponding mythical versions. The vicissitudes of Attis, as we have seen, end once and for all in death. Unlike a Persephone or an Adonis, Attis does not return periodically. He does not have an autumn epiphany, which, mythically conceived in the form of an alternating presence in the underworld and on earth, finds its ritual sanction in the cult, whether it be esoteric or public. Attis appears rather as surviving in death. The pine tree of the March festivals does not express the idea of a periodic manifestation of the deity, but rather in its quality as an evergreen. It reveals him as praesens numen even in the concealment and fixity of death. Death, moreover, has been intrinsically productive on a vegetal level, of whose cyclic rhythm Attis is now the guarantor and divine supporter. If we wonder what prospects, aside from the late elaborations which took place under different ideological influences, were open to the adept through the celebration of the March ritual, we must keep in mind the particular content of that ritual, clearly characterized by the re-evocation of a divine vicissitude with multiple and deep connections with nature. Various meanings have been attributed to these connections in the long course of the history of the Phrygian cult, and the original ideology expressed in it underwent inevitable transformations. Yet the persistence of the cult itself up to a late period, in the form and with the mythical roots I have described, would seem to testify to a relative stability of the fundamental notion essential to it. The annual re-evocation of Attis's doleful destiny, with its joyful conclusion in the certainty of his survival and of his privileged position beside the great goddess, could appear to the devotee as a renewal of his own existential essence in an ordered cosmos whose natural rhythms are guaranteed and supported by divine entities. It could thus appear as a specific chance of salvation.